There is something about Australia that resists easy explanation, not the kind of resistance you feel when a fact is hard to understand, but the deeper kind, the kind that settles in your chest when you realize that a place you thought you knew has been hiding something from you all along. Australia is the oldest continent on Earth. The rocks beneath your feet in the outback are some of the most ancient surfaces on the planet, worn smooth by billions of years of wind and silence and the slow, patient memory of geological time. Most people think of Australia and picture red dust, eucalyptus trees, the long flat shimmer of the Nullarbor Plain stretching to a horizon that seems too far away to be real. They think of the Great Barrier Reef and the sandstone domes of Karachuta and the singular impossible presence of Uluru rising from the desert like a thought the earth had and never finished. What most people do not picture, what most people have never been told about, is what lies beneath all of that. Deep beneath the surface of this ancient continent, hidden in the red earth and the limestone and the compressed dark of places no sunlight has ever touched, there are tunnels, long, winding, smoothly carved passages that stretch for kilometers through solid rock. And the question that has quietly unsettled researchers and geologists and explorers for more than 100 years is deceptively simple. Who made them? If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. There is something about a slow, careful story told in the dark that lets the mind release its grip on the day. So settle in, pull whatever warmth you have a little closer. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Because tonight we are going somewhere most people never think to look. We are going underground. The first thing you need to understand about Australia is that it is not simply old in the way that other places are old. Europe has Roman ruins. Egypt has pyramids. The Middle East has the crumbled foundations of cities that were already ancient when writing was being invented. All of that history, impressive as it is, sits on a relatively shallow shelf of time. The pyramids at Giza are about 4,500 years old. The oldest known human cities reach back perhaps 10 or 11,000 years. But Australia has been continuously inhabited by human beings for at least 65,000 years, possibly longer. The red ochre handprints on the walls of Arnhem land shelters are among the oldest confirmed examples of human art on the planet. The songlines that Aboriginal Australians use to navigate and remember and understand the landscape are not just cultural traditions. They are, in the most literal sense, the oldest known geographic memory system that human beings have ever developed. When an elder in the Western Desert describes a waterhole that exists at the intersection of two songlines, they are drawing on knowledge that has been transmitted generation by generation for a span of time so immense it collapses the imagination. The knowledge encoded in those songs predates the construction of the Egyptian pyramids by tens of thousands of years. So when we talk about ancient things in Australia, we are not talking about ancient in any ordinary sense. We are talking about deep time, about a relationship between people and land that is so old it has become geological in its own way. And it is within that context that the tunnels become genuinely strange. The Nullarbor Plain is a vast limestone plateau in southern Australia, covering roughly 200,000 square kilometres of flat, treeless land stretching across the border between South Australia and Western Australia. The name comes from the Latin nullus arbor, meaning no trees, and that name is honest. The Nullarbor is one of the flattest and most featureless landscapes on Earth. From the surface, it looks like nothing. It looks like the land simply gave up on variety sometime in the distant past and settled into an agreement with the sky to be as horizontal as possible for as long as both of them existed. But beneath the Nullarbor, hidden completely from the flat surface above, is one of the most extraordinary cave systems on the planet. The Nullarbor caves are limestone karst formations, and some of them are among the largest cave chambers in the world. Cocklebiddy Cave, for example, contains one of the longest underwater cave passages ever explored. Divers have penetrated more than 6 kilometers into flooded tunnels, and they still have not found the end. The cave system continues deeper into the rock than human beings have yet been able to follow. But the Nullarbor caves are not the tunnels we are here to talk about tonight. They are a beginning, a door into a larger question, because the Nullarbor caves, as extraordinary as they are, can be explained by the ordinary processes of limestone dissolution. Water seeps through limestone over millions of years, slowly dissolving the rock and leaving behind hollow passages and chambers. That is geology doing what geology does, patient and methodical and entirely explainable. The tunnels that have genuinely puzzled people are different in character. They are different in shape. They are different in the way they feel when you stand inside them. There are places in the Australian wilderness, in Queensland, in New South Wales, in parts of the Northern Territory, where you can find tunnels bored through solid sandstone and granite. Not carved with obvious chisel marks, not created by the slow dissolution of soluble rock, but smoothed, rounded, almost polished on their interior surfaces. These tunnels are typically between 1 and 3 meters in diameter, perfectly circular in cross-section, and they extend horizontally into the rock for distances of anywhere from a few meters to several hundred meters. Some branch, some meet other tunnels at precise angles. Some contain within them smaller side passages that spiral upward or downward in ways that have no obvious geological explanation. Geologists who have examined these formations have proposed several explanations. Some have suggested they were formed by ancient lava tubes, the hollow passages left behind when flowing lava cools and hardens on the outside, while the molten rock inside drains away. But the problem with this explanation is that many of these tunnels exist in regions where there has been no volcanic activity for many millions of years, and the rock types do not support a lava tube origin. Others have suggested they were formed by the action of ancient rivers, carved by water flowing through the rock over immense spans of time. And this explanation works better for some of the formations, but there are tunnels with interior surfaces that seem too smooth, too consistent in their curvature, too regular in their dimensions to be easily explained by the chaotic and variable action of moving water. And then there are the scratch marks in certain of these tunnels. On the smoothed interior walls, there are marks, not the random scratches that rock makes on rock when two surfaces are forced together by geological pressure. These marks are parallel. They run in the direction of the tunnel's axis, and they are spaced with a regularity that suggests they were made by something that moved through the tunnel repeatedly. Something with a consistent physical structure, something that pressed against the walls with an even and distributed force. When researchers first described these marks, they were cautious about their language. Geologists tend to be cautious people. They speak in terms of possible mechanisms and probable explanations and formations consistent with known processes. But in private and eventually in published papers, some of them began to say what the marks looked like. They looked like claw marks, long parallel furrows pressed into the soft rock by something that had pushed through these passages with its body. Something large, something powerful, and something that had done it not once, but many, many times over what must have been an enormous span of years. The question then becomes what kind of creature could have made them? To understand the answer, or at least the most compelling answer that has been offered, you need to know something about the animals that once lived in Australia. Because Australia's prehistoric megafauna, the giant creatures that roamed this continent during the Pleistocene epoch, were not the familiar animals of the African savanna or the North American plains. They were something stranger, something more particular to a continent that had been isolated from the rest of the world for tens of millions of years and had therefore allowed evolution to take paths that nowhere else on Earth had followed. There was the Diprotodon. The Diprotodon was a marsupial, which means it was related to wombats and koalas and kangaroos, but it was the size of a rhinoceros. It weighed roughly 2,000 kilograms, stood about 1.5 meters at the shoulder, and was probably something like an enormous wombat in its general body plan, though the specific details of its appearance are still debated. It grazed on tough, fibrous vegetation across Australia for hundreds of thousands of years, leaving its enormous bones in the fossil record as evidence of its existence. The Diprotodon went extinct sometime between 50 and 45,000 years ago, which places its disappearance frustratingly close to the period when humans first arrived in Australia. And the debate about what caused its extinction has never been fully resolved. There was the Procoptodon, the giant short-faced kangaroo, standing nearly 3 meters tall and weighing perhaps 200 kilograms. There was the Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, which, despite being a marsupial, was a formidable predator with a bite force that exceeded that of any living cat and retractable claws that are genuinely unique in the mammalian fossil record. There was the Megalania, a monitor lizard that reached lengths of perhaps 5 to 7 meters and was the largest terrestrial lizard that ever existed. There was the Palocestes, a strange browsing marsupial with a trunk-like proboscis that no living marsupial possesses, whose exact appearance remains a subject of uncertainty among paleontologists. All of these creatures, and dozens more besides, formed an ecosystem of extraordinary strangeness. Australia was a place where the rules of animal evolution had been written differently, but the creature most relevant to our tunnels tonight is something else entirely, something called the Diprotodontid, and more specifically, something called the wombat, not the wombats that live in Australia today, though those are remarkable enough. Modern wombats are stocky, powerful burrowing marsupials that can weigh up to 40 kilograms and are capable of excavating extensive tunnel systems through compacted soil. They have backward-facing pouches to prevent dirt from falling on their young while they dig, and they can run at speeds of up to 40 kilometers per hour when threatened. Anyone who has spent time in the Australian bush and stumbled across a fresh wombat burrow understands immediately that these are not small or delicate animals. They are built for moving through the earth. But ancient wombats were considerably larger than their modern descendants. Fossils of various extinct wombat-like creatures have been found across Australia, and some of them were enormous. The Diprotodon itself is thought to be a relative of the wombat lineage, though significantly modified. And there is a hypothesis, controversial but not absurd, that some of these large, powerful prehistoric marsupials may have been capable of excavating tunnels through soft rock. The hypothesis has been given a name. The researchers who have examined the tunnels most carefully, particularly a geologist named Heinrich Frank working in South America and Australian colleagues examining similar formations, have proposed that at least some of these strange, smooth, rounded tunnels were created not by geological processes but by animals. They have been called paleoburrows, and the idea, when you sit with it long enough, begins to make a kind of deep, strange sense. Think about what a wombat does. It finds a patch of earth and it begins to dig. It uses its powerful front claws to break the ground and its strong, broad body to push the loosened material backward out of the tunnel as it goes. Over months and years, a single wombat can create a burrow system of extraordinary complexity, with multiple chambers and side passages and alternative entrances. A family group of wombats living in the same area over generations can create a burrow network that extends for dozens of meters. Now scale that up. Imagine an animal the size of a diprotodon, or something intermediate in size between the diprotodon and the modern wombat, doing the same thing. Imagine it doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. Populations of these animals returning to the same tunnel systems generation after generation, deepening and extending them, wearing the walls smooth with the repeated passage of their bodies. The scratch marks on the interior walls would be exactly what you would expect from an animal with strong, curved claws pushing itself through a confined passage. And some of the paleoburrows found in South America, where this hypothesis was first formally proposed and where the evidence is perhaps strongest, are enormous. Researchers in the state of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil found a tunnel nearly 2 meters in diameter and more than 6 meters long, made by a giant ground sloth. Similar formations in Argentina have been attributed to the giant armadillo-like glyptodonts. These are not speculative fantasies. They are documented geological formations in peer-reviewed scientific literature, with clear scratch marks attributable to specific extinct megafauna. Australia's situation is different, and the evidence is less complete, partly because Australia's tropical and subtropical regions experience the kind of weathering and erosion that can obscure or destroy evidence over the timescales involved. But the principle is the same. If giant ground sloths made paleoburrows in South America, there is no reason in principle why Australia's giant marsupials could not have made similar formations in Australia. The question is whether the Australian examples we have found are genuine paleoburrows, geological formations, or something else entirely. And here is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because when Aboriginal Australian oral traditions and ceremonial knowledge are consulted, something unexpected emerges. Aboriginal Australians have one of the most sophisticated and comprehensive systems of ecological knowledge on Earth. Their understanding of the landscape, its plants and animals and waterways and seasonal patterns, is not merely traditional knowledge in the sense of cultural habit. It is an active, living science, refined and tested across thousands of generations by people who depended on the accuracy of their understanding for their survival. When Aboriginal elders describe the behavior of animals, they are drawing on a tradition of observation that is, in many cases, demonstrably more accurate than Western scientific understanding of the same species. There are cases where Aboriginal knowledge of animal behavior has led scientists to observations they would not have made otherwise. The Dreamtime stories and ceremonial knowledge of many Aboriginal groups contain references to enormous creatures that lived underground. In Wiradjuri tradition, there are stories of a great creature called the bunyip that lurks in waterholes and underground passages. The bunyip has been interpreted by Western observers as purely mythological, a kind of bogeyman used to keep children away from dangerous water. But some researchers have suggested that the bunyip tradition, which is remarkably consistent across many different Aboriginal groups in Eastern Australia, despite those groups having different languages and different cultural practices, may represent a transmitted memory of a real creature, something large and aquatic or semi-aquatic that lived in Australia's rivers and lakes and underground water systems. The Diprotodon has been proposed as one possible candidate. Its large, heavy bones and its probable habit of wallowing in shallow water might have made it associated in Aboriginal memory with waterways and underground spaces. There are also stories that do not involve the bunyip, but that describe, in ways that seem oblique until you're looking for them, the existence of underground passages in specific locations. Songlines, the navigational and ceremonial routes that crisscross the Australian continent, sometimes specifically follow routes that go underground or that reference underground features. There are sacred sites where the ground is understood to be hollow, where the earth is described as having a depth that is not merely physical but also spiritual and historical. And in some of these locations, when geologists have subsequently examined the geology, they have found exactly what the traditions described. Not always tunnels, sometimes just the structural conditions that would support tunnel formation. But the correlation between the places where Aboriginal tradition says the ground is hollow and the places where geological investigation has found underground passages is not nothing. It is not proof of anything in a strict scientific sense, but it is interesting. It is the kind of interesting that, if you pay attention to it long enough, starts to reshape the way you think about what kinds of knowledge can survive across tens of thousands of years. Let us go deeper into a specific location, because the abstract is always less interesting than the particular. In the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, in the deep sandstone country that the Darug and Gundungurra peoples have inhabited for many thousands of years, there are formations in the sandstone that have puzzled geologists since European settlers first began exploring the region in the early 19th century. The Blue Mountains are not actually mountains in the strict geological sense. They are a deeply dissected plateau, the remnant of a vast sandstone formation that has been carved into its current dramatic shape by millions of years of erosion. The valleys and gorges that cut through the Blue Mountains are some of the most visually striking landscapes in Australia, with sheer sandstone cliffs dropping hundreds of meters to densely forested floors. But within the sandstone walls of these cliffs, there are tunnels. Some of them are quite large enough for a person to walk through. Some of them connect to other tunnels through narrow passages that require crawling. Some of them end abruptly, their back walls showing the same smooth, rounded finish that characterizes the puzzling formations found elsewhere in Australia. European settlers, when they first encountered these tunnels in the early decades of the 19th century, assumed they were the work of Aboriginal Australians. But the Aboriginal groups of the Blue Mountains region, when asked, consistently said they had not made the tunnels. The tunnels were already there when their ancestors arrived. They were already ancient. The Darug people have specific terms for these formations that distinguish them from caves, which they understand and describe differently, and from watercourses. The tunnels are something else in their conceptual framework, and the stories associated with them describe them as the passages of something that lived there before human beings arrived. The sandstone of the Blue Mountains is not limestone. It does not dissolve in water in the same way. The formation of tunnels in sandstone is possible through a process called piping, where the movement of water through the rock gradually removes material particle by particle. But the process tends to produce irregular and branching passages rather than the smooth, consistently rounded tunnels found in some Blue Mountains locations. And the scale of some of these formations is difficult to attribute to piping alone, given the structural characteristics of the rock and the hydrological conditions of the area. What made them then? There is another creature that needs to be part of this conversation, one that has been somewhat overlooked in discussions of Australia's ancient underground formations, the echidna. The short-beaked echidna is one of only 5 surviving species of monotremes, the egg-laying mammals, in the world. It is related to the platypus. It has a long snout adapted for probing into termite mounds and soil for ants and other invertebrates. It has strong, flat claws specifically designed for digging. And there is fossil evidence of extinct echidna species that were considerably larger than the modern echidna, which itself weighs between 2 and 7 kilograms. An echidna the size of a wombat would be a formidable burrowing machine. Its body plan, low and powerful with digging forelimbs and a body shaped to move through confined passages, is almost perfectly suited to tunnel construction. And echidnas, when threatened, do not run. They dig. They press themselves into the ground with extraordinary speed and force, using their whole body to work their way into the earth. There is also the consideration of time. The paleoburrow hypothesis does not require these tunnels to have been made quickly. It requires only that they were made. A population of large burrowing marsupials living in a particular area and returning to the same tunnel systems over thousands of years could produce formations of considerable size and extent without any individual excavation event being particularly dramatic. Stone is harder than soil, but it is not infinitely harder, and certain sandstones and softer rock types can be worked by claws and sustained force over long periods. The wearing smooth of the interior walls would happen gradually, as body after body moved through the passages, each contact removing the smallest amount of material, the cumulative effect over millennia being the polished surfaces we find today. But here is the thing that no geological hypothesis, however reasonable, has fully addressed: the regularity. In certain of the Australian tunnel formations, there is a consistency in the dimensions and the curvature that goes beyond what random biological digging would be expected to produce. The passage dimensions in some locations are remarkably consistent for stretches of many meters. The curvature of the walls is smooth and even in ways that suggest something more systematic than an animal simply pushing through rock in search of food or shelter. When geologists or architects encounter a structure with these characteristics, the word that comes to mind, reluctantly but persistently, is engineered. Nobody in mainstream science is seriously suggesting that the Australian tunnels were engineered by an ancient human civilization. The evidence does not support that conclusion, and the geological and biological explanations, while incomplete, are more parsimonious. but the word engineered keeps coming up in a different sense. Not engineered by intelligence, but engineered by evolution, shaped by the systematic behavior of animals whose bodies and behaviors were themselves shaped by millions of years of natural selection to produce exactly this kind of passage, with exactly this kind of consistency, because consistency in tunnel dimensions is functionally important for an animal that needs to move through the tunnel efficiently. A tunnel that is too narrow at one point becomes a trap. A tunnel that is too wide is inefficient to dig and poorly insulating. The optimal dimensions for a burrowing animal of a given size are determined by the animal's own body, and an animal that consistently digs tunnels slightly larger than itself, smooth to a consistent radius by the repeated passage of its body, will produce exactly the kind of formation that we find puzzling when we encounter it without knowing its origin. This is not a satisfying mystery in the sense that it resolves neatly. It is satisfying in a different way, a deeper way, because what it reveals is the extraordinary persistence of the natural world's record keeping. These tunnels, if the paleo-burrow hypothesis is correct, are the traces of animals that have been extinct for perhaps 40,000 years. They are, in effect, the largest and most permanent fossils left by Australia's vanished megafauna. Not bones preserved in sediment, but the very shapes carved into the rock by the bodies of creatures that no living human has ever seen. You can stand inside one of these tunnels and run your hand along the smoothed wall and be touching a surface that was last touched by something alive tens of thousands of years ago. Something enormous and warm-blooded and purposeful, moving through its own underground world in the darkness beneath an Australia that no longer exists. There are places in Australia where you can have that experience. There are places where the land gives you that access to deep time without requiring any special equipment or expertise. You only need to know where to look, and you need to be willing to go underground. The Wellington Caves in central New South Wales are a good place to begin. They are limestone caves, so they fall into the category of karst geology rather than the more puzzling tunnel formations we have been discussing. But they are relevant because of what was found there. In the early 19th century, long before most of the world knew that Australia had any significant cave systems, a naturalist named Thomas Mitchell explored the Wellington Caves and found, to his considerable astonishment, enormous deposits of fossil bones. The bones were those of animals that were not alive in Australia in the 19th century and had not been alive for a very long time. Mitchell carefully documented his findings and eventually sent specimens to Europe, where they attracted the attention of scientists who recognized that Australia had once been home to a fauna quite different from its modern one. The bones from Wellington Caves contributed significantly to the early understanding of Australian megafauna. They told part of the story of a world that had existed and vanished long before any European had ever set foot on the continent. What Mitchell could not have fully understood, and what researchers are still working to understand today, is the relationship between those extinct animals and the cave systems themselves. Were the bones in the caves because the animals had fallen in through surface openings? Were the caves used as shelter or den sites by living animals? Were some of the cave passages actually created by the animals whose bones were found within them? These questions have not been definitively answered, and they are still being asked. But let us leave the limestone caves behind and move into stranger country. Let us go north into Queensland, where the landscape changes from the temperate world of the Blue Mountains and the flat country around Wellington into something more tropical, more ancient feeling, more difficult to categorize. The Carnarvon Gorge in central Queensland is a place that has a quality almost impossible to describe to someone who has not been there. The gorge was carved by the Carnarvon Creek over many millions of years through a thick deposit of white sandstone, and the result is a narrow, winding canyon with sheer walls rising up to 200 meters above the creek. The contrast between the pale sandstone walls and the intensely green vegetation on the canyon floor is visually striking in a way that photographs never quite capture. But what makes Carnarvon Gorge remarkable beyond its visual drama is the density of cultural material it contains. The sandstone walls of the gorge are covered with Aboriginal art, stencils and engravings, and freehand paintings in a variety of styles that represent different periods of Aboriginal occupation going back many thousands of years. There are galleries of hand stencils that extend for many meters along the canyon walls, red and yellow ochre pressed and blown against the stone, leaving the negative spaces of hands that belong to people who lived in this gorge at intervals across a span of time we can barely conceptualize. But within the sandstone walls of Carnarvon Gorge, alongside the art galleries, there are also passages, narrow, rounded openings in the rock that lead into darker spaces. Some of them are clearly natural features, undercuts formed by differential weathering of the sandstone layers. But others are harder to categorize. They have dimensions and smoothness and orientation that raise questions. And the Bidjara people, the traditional custodians of the Carnarvon country, have always understood these passages as significant features of the landscape, as places where boundaries between the ordinary world and the dreamtime world are thin. It is important to approach Aboriginal concepts carefully and not to flatten them into Western frameworks. The dreamtime is not simply the past. It is not a creation story in the way that Western creation stories work. It is, among other things, a way of understanding that the world is continuously being created, and that certain places are points of connection between the ongoing act of creation and the surface of the world where daily life happens. Underground spaces, and particularly underground passages, appear in many Aboriginal traditions as exactly these kinds of points of connection. They are places where the creative forces of the dreamtime can be accessed, where the deep structure of the world is closer to the surface. This understanding may be, in part, a cultural and spiritual interpretation of the physical reality that underground spaces represent geological deep time in a tangible way. When you go underground, you are literally surrounded by rock that is older than anything on the surface. The geological age of the material around you is not abstract when you're inside it. The Quincan rock art sites near Laura in Cape York Peninsula contain some of the most remarkable Aboriginal art in Australia, and they contain depictions of figures that have generated genuine scholarly debate. The Quincan figures, named for the spirit beings they represent, are tall, attenuated, sometimes featuring strange anatomical details that do not correspond to human anatomy. Some researchers have suggested that the Quincan figures represent the memory of actual encounters with other beings that were real in the physical world and that have since disappeared. The Quincans in the tradition of the local Kukuthapan people are associated with specific landscape features, including caves and rock overhangs and underground spaces. They are understood as beings that live in the rock, that pass through solid stone with ease, that inhabit the underground world and emerge from it at certain times. Whether these traditions represent the memory of actual prehistoric animals, of encounters with creatures that are now extinct, is not something that can be proven, but the possibility is not absurd. If human populations have lived in Australia continuously for 65,000 years, and if large animals went extinct in Australia perhaps 45 to 50,000 years ago, then there was a period of 10 to 20,000 years during which human beings and these large animals coexisted. 20,000 years is enough time for encounters to become stories, for the physical characteristics of animals to become incorporated into cultural memory, for specific landscape features associated with specific animals to become places of cultural significance. The traditions about underground beings living in rock passages may be, at their core, a memory of the enormous burrowing creatures that once actually lived in those passages. This is speculation, careful speculation, but speculation nonetheless. What is not speculation is that the tunnels exist. What is not speculation is that they have the physical characteristics that have been described. What is not speculation is that the geological explanations for some of them are incomplete or contested. And what is not speculation is that Aboriginal traditions associated with underground spaces and underground beings are ancient and persistent and geographically widespread in ways that suggest they are responding to something real. Let us go even further into the specifics of what the tunnels look like when you're inside them. The experience of being inside one of the smoothed, rounded Australian tunnel formations is unusual in a way that is hard to convey. It is different from being in a cave, which tends to feel random, chaotic, shaped by the accidents of water and time without any particular consistency. It is different from being in an artificial tunnel, which has a human scale and human intentions built into its dimensions. The paleoburrow formations, if that is what they are, feel like something in between. The scale is not human. The dimensions are slightly wrong for a human body, not so wrong that you cannot fit, but wrong enough that you are aware at every moment that the space was not made for you. The ceiling is too round, the floor too curved, the passage too consistent in its diameter for too long a stretch. You find yourself thinking of the space as a body, as a shape that something else occupied, as a negative impression of a creature that is no longer there. There is an installation artist in New South Wales who spent several years visiting and documenting the tunnel formations of the state's interior. She is not a scientist, but her observations are detailed and her documentation careful. She described the experience of being in the formations as feeling like being inside an absence, not a space left by the removal of rock in an abstract sense, but a space left by the removal of a specific thing, a thing with a particular shape and a particular weight and a particular warmth. She described the scratch marks on the walls as handwriting, not because she thought they conveyed literal meaning, but because they had that quality of intentionality, of something being pressed into a surface repeatedly and deliberately. She said that the deepest of the tunnels she visited, one that extended more than 80 meters into a sandstone outcrop in the Warrumbungle region, felt like the interior of a memory, like being inside something that the rock had not forgotten, even though the thing itself was gone. That is not science, but it is an honest description of what the experience feels like. And the experience of a physical space, the way it presents itself to a human body moving through it, is not nothing. It is data of a different kind, data about the relationship between scale and form and the expectations that our bodies carry from living in a world shaped primarily by human hands. When a space violates those expectations in consistent and structured ways, there is something worth paying attention to in that violation. Now, let us talk about the water, because the tunnels are not only a geological mystery and a biological hypothesis and a cultural tradition, they are also, in many cases, part of an underground hydrological system that is itself extraordinary. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. The interior of the continent receives very little rainfall, and what rainfall does arrive tends to be irregular and unpredictable. The rivers of the interior, when they flow at all, flow only briefly after significant rainfall events and then sink back into the dry ground or evaporate in the fierce heat. But beneath the Australian interior, there is water, enormous quantities of water stored in aquifers and underground formations that are among the largest in the world. The Great Artesian Basin, which underlies roughly 22% of the Australian continent, is one of the largest and deepest freshwater aquifer systems on Earth. It contains water that fell as rain approximately 2 million years ago, and that has been slowly moving through the porous rock of the basin ever since, filtered and stored and held in the dark beneath the dry land above. The tunnels in some parts of Australia connect to this underground water system. They do not obviously penetrate the aquifer itself, which is much deeper than the surface formations we have been discussing, but they often lead to underground springs or to chambers where water collects. And this is ecologically significant. For a large burrowing animal in a dry landscape, access to underground water would be an enormous survival advantage. The ability to dig down to where moisture persists, even in the driest conditions. The ability to find shelter from extreme heat in the cool underground passages. The ability to access food sources in the form of roots and underground invertebrates. These would all be powerful drivers of burrowing behavior. The paleoburrow hypothesis makes ecological sense not just as an explanation of the physical characteristics of the tunnels, but as an understanding of why animals would have invested the enormous energy required to create them. And the energy investment is significant. Digging through rock, even relatively soft sandstone, requires enormous force. The claws of modern wombats are powerful, but they work primarily in soil and clay, not in consolidated rock. For an animal to dig in sandstone would require claws of a specific hardness and curvature, considerable body weight to provide the downward and forward force needed to press against the rock surface, and a body shape that allowed the animal to brace against the tunnel walls while it worked. Interestingly, the Diprotodon and some other large Pleistocene marsupials had skeletal features that are consistent with these requirements, though exactly how much they dug and whether they were capable of excavating in consolidated rock is still debated. The comparison with South American paleoburrows is instructive here because the tunnel formations in South America are considerably better documented, and the evidence linking them to specific extinct megafauna is considerably stronger. Some of the South American tunnels are associated with claw marks that have been matched to the forelimb dimensions of specific extinct ground sloths. The geological context has been carefully analyzed. The dating of the formations is consistent with the period of megafauna existence in South America. The case for giant ground sloth paleoburrows in Brazil and Argentina is not certain, but is strong enough to be accepted as a serious hypothesis by mainstream paleontologists. If that hypothesis is correct for South America, the Australian case becomes more plausible by analogy. Both continents had large Pleistocene megafauna that went extinct roughly around the same time, though the mechanisms of extinction are different. Both continents have tunnel formations with characteristics that are difficult to explain by purely geological processes. Both continents have indigenous cultural traditions associated with underground beings and underground spaces. The parallel is not proof, but it is suggestive. There is one more layer to this story, one that sits beneath even the Paleoburrow hypothesis and connects it to questions that go much deeper into the history of life on Earth. The Australian continent has been isolated from the rest of the world's major land masses for roughly 80 million years. During that enormous span of time, the animals of Australia evolved along lines determined entirely by their local conditions and the accidents of which species happened to be present when the isolation began. The marsupials of Australia are the descendants of animals that were present when Australia separated from Antarctica and began its long drift northward through the Southern Ocean. The monotrem's, the egg-laying mammals, represent an even older lineage, one that diverged from the ancestors of placental mammals perhaps 210 million years ago. When you hold an echidna, you are holding something that carries evolutionary history going back to a world before Australia existed as a separate continent. The burrowing behavior of Australian marsupials is ancient. The wombat lineage, which is the most committed to underground living of any of the surviving large Australian marsupials, represents an adaptation that developed over millions of years in the specific conditions of the Australian interior. The backward-facing pouch of wombats, which prevents dirt from falling onto the joey while the mother digs, is an adaptation that makes no sense in any context other than sustained burrowing behavior. It is an adaptation to living underground, built into the animal's reproductive anatomy over an immense span of evolutionary time. If the extinct relatives of the wombat, the diprotodontids in their various forms, retained any of this burrowing tendency, even in modified form, the existence of paleoburrows in Australian rock becomes much easier to understand. Not as an extraordinary behavior, but as the expression of an ancient, deeply embedded tendency to go underground, to use the earth itself as shelter and resource, carried forward in the biology of Australian marsupials for tens of millions of years, and expressed in the largest of those marsupials in the most dramatic way. The tunnels then may be not just the traces of specific extinct animals, but the record of a behavioral tendency that is as old as the marsupial lineage in Australia. They may be one of the most ancient things in an ancient land, older than the megafauna that made them, rooted in an evolutionary history that stretches back to a world very different from the one we live in. There are researchers in Australia today who are working on exactly this question. They are using a combination of geological analysis, paleontological data, and computer modeling to try to determine which formations can be confidently attributed to specific biological agents and which remain genuinely unexplained. The work is slow and careful and provisional in the way that good science always is. But it is moving toward answers, and the answers, even the partial ones, are rewriting in quiet ways what we understand about the Australian past. There is also a growing conversation about the relationship between this research and Aboriginal knowledge systems. Some Aboriginal communities are participating in the geological and paleontological research, sharing traditional knowledge about specific locations and traditional understandings of specific landscape features, and finding that this knowledge often aligns with what the physical evidence suggests in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The process of bringing these two knowledge systems into dialogue is complex and requires genuine mutual respect and careful attention to the protocols and conditions under which traditional knowledge is shared. But where it has happened, the results have been productive. The physical evidence and the traditional knowledge often point in the same direction, and together they are more informative than either would be alone. This is part of a larger shift happening in Australian science and in the relationship between scientific institutions and Aboriginal Australians. The recognition that 65,000 years of careful, systematic, transmitted observation of the Australian landscape represents a form of knowledge that is both deep and reliable is not new among the researchers who work closely with Aboriginal communities, but it is becoming more broadly accepted. The specific case of the underground formations is one instance of a much larger pattern, one in which traditional knowledge is leading researchers to physical evidence they would not otherwise have found, or helping them interpret physical evidence that the available scientific frameworks could not satisfactorily explain. There are places in Australia, specific places, where you can stand on the surface and know that beneath your feet there are passages that were made by something alive, something enormous, something that moved through the dark rock of this continent in an era when the landscape above was populated by animals that no longer exist, and the night sky looked at land that no human would walk for tens of thousands of years more. The feeling of standing in one of those places is difficult to describe precisely because it is not a feeling that our usual frameworks prepare us for. We are accustomed to encountering the past through objects, through things that were made and left behind. We are less accustomed to encountering it through spaces, through the absence of something that was once present. But the tunnels are exactly that kind of encounter. They are the shape of something gone. They are the rock remembering a body that no longer exists. And there is something profound about that, something that the geological record alone, the dry sequence of strata and formations and dates and mineralogical compositions, cannot fully convey. The tunnels are a kind of intimacy with deep time. They are the way that the ancient past physically touches the present, not through a specimen in a museum case behind glass, but through a space that you can enter, that surrounds you, that presses close enough that you can touch the walls on both sides simultaneously and know that whatever made this passage also touched both of those surfaces, pressed against them with its body, breathed in the air of this underground world, and moved forward into the dark. Let us return to the surface for a moment and think about what the landscape looks like when you know what is underneath it. The Australian outback, seen from the air, has a quality that is hard to put into words. From altitude, the patterns in the landscape become visible that are not visible from the ground. Ancient river courses, dry for thousands of years, show as lighter lines in the darker rock. Salt pans shimmer white in the far interior. The circles of ancient impact craters, some of them among the best preserved on Earth, mark places where rock from space struck the land hundreds of millions of years ago. And in certain areas, you can see, or if you know what to look for, the subtle depressions in the ground surface that indicate the collapse of underground passages below. These surface features are not dramatic. They are gentle, shallow depressions, sometimes arranged in lines, sometimes in clusters. But they tell you that the ground beneath them is hollow, that there are spaces down there in the rock, they are gentle, shallow depressions, sometimes arranged in lines, sometimes in clusters. But they tell you that the ground beneath them is hollow, that there are spaces down there in the rock, that the surface you are looking at is more porous than it appears. Some of these surface depressions align with the locations of known underground formations. Some of them are in areas where no detailed underground survey has been conducted, areas that remain literally unexplored below ground level. Australia is a large continent, and the resources available for systematic underground survey are limited. There are vast stretches of the interior where the underground geology is known only in broad outline, where the detailed picture of what lies beneath the surface has never been examined at a resolution that would allow individual formations to be identified. It is entirely possible, and in fact quite likely, that there are tunnel and paleoburrow formations in Australia that have not yet been found and that will not be found until someone goes looking in the right place. The scale of what remains unknown beneath the Australian surface is itself astonishing. The Great Artesian Basin, which I mentioned earlier, covers an area of roughly 1.7 million square kilometers, making it one of the largest groundwater basins in the world. Its water is held in porous sandstone formations, and those sandstone formations extend to depths of nearly 3 kilometers in places. The full three-dimensional structure of the basin has never been completely mapped. The passages and chambers and formations within the porous sandstone are known only where boreholes have been drilled or where springs emerge at the surface. Everything else is inference, model, extrapolation from incomplete data. Somewhere in that vast underground world, there may be formations that would change our understanding significantly if we knew they were there. The springs that emerge from the Great Artesian Basin, called mound springs, are some of the most ecologically significant features in the Australian interior. They emerge from the ground at consistent temperatures regardless of season, creating small oases of permanent water and wet vegetation in landscapes that are otherwise desperately dry. They have been used by Aboriginal Australians for tens of thousands of years, and many of them are sites of considerable cultural significance. The water that flows from them fell as rain in the mountains of Queensland perhaps 2 million years ago and has been travelling slowly through the sandstone of the basin ever since. When you drink from a mound spring, you are drinking rain from the Pleistocene. You are drinking the water of a world that existed before our species had left Africa. The mound springs attract wildlife. They always have. In the Pleistocene, the mound springs of the Great Artesian Basin would have been gathering places for the megafauna of the interior, sources of reliable water in a dry landscape, places where diprotodonts and giant kangaroos and thylacoleos would have congregated. And the underground passages that lead to the water, the routes through the rock that connect the deeper aquifer to the surface springs, would have been known to and possibly used by burrowing animals in the vicinity. This is all theoretical, but it is the kind of theory that connects naturally to the physical evidence in a way that makes the whole picture more coherent. The tunnels, the springs, the megafauna, the deep aquifer, the dry surface, the Aboriginal traditions about underground water and underground beings. They all fit together into a picture of an Australia that was different from the one we know today, inhabited by different animals, structured by different ecological relationships and yet continuous with the present in the way that all histories are continuous. The present is always a consequence of the past, and sometimes the past leaves its traces in the rocks in ways that we are only beginning to read. It is worth saying something at this point about the experience of time in Australia, because it is different from the experience of time in most other places, and that difference is relevant to what we have been discussing. In Europe or in East Asia or in the Middle East, the sense of historical depth you encounter is primarily human historical depth. The oldest things in the landscape were made by people. The ruins of Roman aqueducts and medieval castles and ancient temples give the landscape a human past that stretches back a few thousand years, sometimes a little more. The non-human past, the geological and biological history of those places, is present but tends to be less immediately accessible. You have to know where to look. You have to go to a museum or a quarry or a particular hillside to find the traces of geological deep time. The human past tends to dominate. In Australia, it is different. The human past is there, and it is deep by the standards of most of the world. 65,000 years of Aboriginal occupation leaves a substantial record in the landscape, as we have discussed. But the geological and biological past is so extreme in its age that even the Aboriginal record, ancient as it is, sits on top of it as a relatively recent surface feature. The rocks of the Pilbara region in Western Australia are among the oldest exposed rocks on the surface of the Earth, with some formations dating to more than 3 billion years ago. The stromatolites in Shark Bay, the living colonies of cyanobacteria that build layered limestone structures in shallow water, are functionally identical to organisms that existed 3.5 billion years ago. When you look at a stromatolite, you are looking at something that has been doing the same thing in more or less the same way for longer than the continents have had their current shapes. In a landscape with that kind of geological depth, the tunnels made by Pleistocene megafauna 40,000 years ago feel paradoxically almost recent. They are traces of the geological present, of an era that, by Australian standards, is practically yesterday. And yet they are older than all of human civilization. They predate the invention of writing by 30,000 years. They predate the construction of the first cities by 35,000 years. They were made in a world that is, from the perspective of human history, completely alien. This is the gift that deep time offers when you're willing to sit with it. It dissolves the sense that the world as we currently know it is the permanent or obvious form of things. The tunnels in the Australian rock are a reminder that this continent has been inhabited by creatures of extraordinary diversity for an enormous span of time, and that the current human occupation of Australia, even including the 65,000-year Aboriginal presence, is a recent event in the full history of the place. The Diprotodont grazed on the plains of what is now the Murray-Darling Basin for hundreds of thousands of years before the first human foot touched Australian soil. The Thylacoleo hunted in forests that grew on land that is now open grassland. The Megalania moved through ecosystems that no living person has ever seen except in partial reconstruction from bones and pollen records and other fragmentary evidence. And somewhere beneath the current surface, in the darkness that geological time creates, the traces of those lives persist. The tunnels wait in the rock, patient and anonymous, holding their smoothed walls and their parallel scratch marks and their circular cross sections against the day when someone will find them and ask once again the question that is both simple and vast. Who made this? The answer, or the beginning of an answer, is not frightening. It is not mystical. It is, in a way, more extraordinary than either of those things would be. It is biological. It is evolutionary. It is the record of a lineage of creatures doing what creatures do, using the world around them to survive, leaving in the process a mark on the physical landscape that persists long after the creatures themselves are gone. The paleoburrows are fossils, not of bones, but of behavior, not of what the animals were, but of what they did. And in some ways, that is the more intimate trace, because behavior is the expression of a living thing in its world, the record of its choices and its capacities and its relationship with the particular landscape it inhabited. To walk into a paleoburrow, if that is what the tunnels are, is to enter the behavioral fossil of an extinct animal. It is to stand in the record of how something moved through the world, in the specific underground world that it made for itself. There is nothing else quite like that experience in the natural world. It is the closest we can come without a time machine to being in the presence of something that is genuinely gone. The stars above the Australian outback are extraordinary. If you are in a location far enough from any settlement, with no clouds and no moon, the density of stars visible to the naked eye is astonishing. The Milky Way is not just a faint smear at the zenith, but a structural presence in the sky, arching from horizon to horizon with enough complexity that you can see it differently at different moments, now as a cloud of light, now as a river, now as a landscape in its own right, a terrain of light above the dark terrain of the earth. Aboriginal Australians have a rich astronomical tradition that is often described in terms of the constellations they identified, which are different from Western constellations and include dark constellations made of the dark spaces between the stars rather than the stars themselves. The emu in the sky, a dark constellation visible in the southern hemisphere and recognized across many different Aboriginal groups, is traced not by stars but by the dark nebulae in the Milky Way, the regions where dust clouds obscure the stars behind them. The emu's head is in the Coalsack Nebula near the Southern Cross, and its body stretches along the Milky Way toward Scorpius. But the astronomical tradition I want to mention here is a different one. Many Aboriginal groups have traditions about the sky that encode specific ecological and seasonal knowledge. The appearance of certain stars or certain star clusters signals the beginning of specific seasons or the availability of specific food resources. The Pleiades, the bright star cluster that appears low in the eastern sky in late autumn from Australia, are associated in many traditions with the gathering of particular plant foods. The appearance of Scorpius in the western sky at dusk signals, in certain traditions, a change in the behavior of specific animals. These astronomical calendars encode not just timekeeping, but ecological knowledge, information about the rhythms of the natural world transmitted through the medium of the night sky. The connection to underground formations is indirect but real. The animals whose behavior is tracked by these astronomical calendars are surface animals, and their behavior is seasonal, connected to rainfall and temperature and the availability of specific plants. But some of those animals in their Pleistocene versions were underground animals too. Their seasonal patterns of emergence and retreat, if they had such patterns, would have been part of the ecological knowledge that Aboriginal Australians accumulated and transmitted across tens of thousands of years. The underground world was not separate from the surface world in the understanding of the people who lived with both of them for all that time. It was continuous with it, another dimension of the same landscape, accessible through specific points and associated with specific traditions and specific behaviors. When the Diprotodon emerged from its underground shelter in the spring, or descended into it in the height of summer, the timing and location of that emergence and retreat would have been noticed. It would have been meaningful. It would have been incorporated into the knowledge system that made it possible to live in this landscape successfully across tens of thousands of years. And traces of that knowledge may persist, encoded in traditions about underground beings and underground spaces, waiting for the right kind of attention to read them. This is where science and tradition converge in the most interesting way. Not by one displacing the other, not by science confirming tradition or tradition correcting science, but by both pointing toward the same reality from different directions and allowing us, through the comparison, to see the reality more completely than either could show us alone. The tunnels are real. They exist in the rock of the Australian continent. They have physical characteristics that are genuinely puzzling in some cases and genuinely interesting in all cases. The biological hypothesis for their origin is reasonable and is supported by analogy with better documented examples on other continents. The Aboriginal traditions associated with underground spaces are ancient and consistent and point in ways that are difficult to dismiss toward the reality of these underground formations as features of the landscape with specific significance. And the geological context, the deep age of the Australian continent, the extraordinary span of time during which the Australian megafauna existed, the specific characteristics of the rock types in which the tunnels are found, all of this is consistent with a picture in which very large animals dug very deep into the rock of this continent over a very long time and left behind the specific traces that we are now trying to read. We do not know everything. We probably never will know everything. The evidence is incomplete and will remain incomplete because too much time has passed for a complete record to survive. But the outline of the story is becoming visible, and the outline is, in the most literal sense, the shape of something gone, preserved in the patience of the rock. You're listening to this in the dark, and somewhere far to the south and east of you, if you have any imagination at all, there is a continent the color of red dust and white salt, sitting on the edge of the Southern Ocean, breathing in the night air of the most ancient exposed land surface on Earth. And beneath that surface, in the darkness where no light has ever reached, there are passages, smooth and rounded and scratched with the marks of something enormous that pushed through them in an age before any living thing now on Earth was born. The rock holds them, the time holds them, and they wait, patient and permanent, for whoever comes next to go deep enough to find them. Let the question settle now. Let it move from something you are thinking about to something you are simply aware of. The way you are aware of the darkness outside the window, or the weight of the blanket, or the sound of your own breathing. The tunnels are there. The animals that made them are gone. The time between then and now is so vast that the mind cannot hold it directly, but can feel the edges of it, the way you can feel the edge of sleep, without quite knowing when you cross it. The Diprotodon moved through the dark underground of Australia for perhaps 100,000 years. It grazed and sheltered and dug and left its traces in the rock, and then it was gone. What remains is the rock. What remains is the shape the rock remembers. What remains is the darkness of those passages, unchanged and unchanged able, holding the form of something that was once alive in the most literal way that the earth can hold anything. There is a quietness to this kind of knowledge. It does not demand anything of you, it simply is. The tunnels were there before you were born, and they will be there long after. The questions they raise will be answered, or they will not. The science will advance, or it will stall. The traditions will continue to be shared, or they will fall silent. But the passages in the rock will remain regardless, patient as only stone can be patient, holding their smoothed walls and their ancient darkness and the echo of something enormous that moved through them when the world was different. You can let your thinking slow now. The story has been told, or as much of it as can be told tonight. The rest is in the rock, and the rock is not going anywhere. Somewhere in Queensland, there is a sandstone outcrop with a smooth circular opening in its base, and inside that opening there is a passage that extends back into the stone, and the walls of that passage are worn smooth by the repeated passage of something that no longer exists. The temperature in there is constant. It does not change with the season or the time of day. The silence in there is the silence of stone, which is different from any other silence, heavier and more absolute, because stone does not move or breathe or shift, it only holds. And what it holds in those tunnels, if you are patient enough and quiet enough to listen to it, is the shape of deep time, the outline of a world that was and is gone, the fossilized behavior of creatures that walked this continent for 1,000 centuries before the first human fire was ever lit on its soil. Let that thought carry you. The continent below, the stars above, the ancient passages in between, the slow turning of the earth, unchanged from the time when enormous marsupials moved through their underground world in the darkness, unchanged from the time when the first human beings in Australia looked up at the same stars and began to understand the land they had come to. The world is old, the questions are deep, the sleep is coming. Rest now. The tunnels will still be there in the morning, and somewhere in the red rock of the ancient continent, the walls are smooth and cool and waiting, as they have always been waiting, as they will always be. The night is a good time for knowing this. It is a good time for letting the weight of geological time press gently on the mind, until the mind stops trying to hold it and simply floats in it instead. The way you float in the dark just before sleep takes you, not quite in the world anymore, not quite out of it, suspended in the passage between one state and another, like a tunnel in the rock, smooth and dark and endless and still. The earth is old, the earth is patient, and somewhere beneath the surface of the oldest continent, in the darkness that has never been broken by light, something made a passage once, and the passage remains. That is enough for tonight. Rest. There is a place in the Northern Territory, not far from the town of Katherine, where the gorge system cuts through ancient sandstone in a series of linked canyons that stretch for many kilometers inland from the Katherine River. The Nitmiluk Gorge, called Nitmiluk by the Jawoyn people, who are its traditional custodians, is one of the most visually dramatic landscapes in northern Australia. The sandstone walls rise sheer from the water in sections, orange and red, and layered with the horizontal banding that marks the ancient depositional history of the rock. The gorge is not one continuous canyon, but a sequence of up to 13 separate gorges connected by shallow passages of water, and in the dry season, by stretches of rock that you must cross on foot to move from one section to the next. The river moves differently in different sections of the gorge, sometimes broad and calm and deeply green, sometimes narrow and rapid where the walls press close together, sometimes disappearing into darkness where the rock has arched over the water to form a natural ceiling. Within the walls of Nitmiluk there are openings. Not all of them are significant. Sandstone weathers in ways that produce random seeming cavities and overhangs, and most of what you see in the gorge walls is simply the ordinary weathering of an ancient sedimentary formation. But some of the openings are different. Some of them lead into passages that extend further into the rock than the angle of weathering would predict. Passages that have the rounded cross section and the smooth interior surfaces that we have been discussing throughout this story. The Jawan people understand specific passages in the Nitmiluk system as the homes of Bula, a creative spirit associated with the underground world and with the power of water to move through and under the earth. The connection between underground passages and water is significant here, as it is in many Aboriginal traditions about underground spaces. The water does not stay on the surface, it goes down, and the beings associated with underground spaces are also associated with water's capacity to move through the solid rock, to find passages that are not visible from above. In the dry season, when the river drops and the rock is exposed, you can sometimes see formations in the gorge walls that are partially obscured by the waterline for most of the year. Some of these formations are horizontal passages at the level of the old water table, passages that were carved or enlarged when the river ran higher, when the climate was different, when the gorge was a different kind of place. The geological record of climate change is written in the gorge walls in a language of water levels and rock types and the specific chemistry of different eras of erosion. Reading that record requires training and patience, but it reveals a history of this gorge that is considerably more complex than its current form suggests. The Katherine region experienced dramatically different climate conditions during the Pleistocene. Northern Australia generally was wetter during some periods of the ice ages, counterintuitively, as global circulation patterns shifted and monsoon systems expanded or contracted in ways that were different from the current pattern. There were periods when the rivers of the Northern Territory ran more consistently and at higher levels than they do today. There were periods when the forests were more extensive and the water more abundant. In those periods, the underground water system was different. The aquifers were more full, the springs more numerous, and the animals that depended on water were distributed differently across the landscape. The Diprotodon fossils found in the Northern Territory suggest that this enormous creature lived in the region during the Pleistocene. It would have needed access to reliable water, and in the Nitmiluk region, it would have found that water in the Katherine River and in the springs that emerged from the sandstone in various locations. The gorge itself, with its sheltered aspect and its reliable water, would have been an attractive location for a large animal needing shade and moisture in a seasonally harsh landscape. Whether the Nitmiluk sandstone contains genuine paleoburrow formations is not something that has been definitively determined. The gorge has been examined primarily from a cultural heritage and geomorphological perspective. not specifically with the paleoburrow hypothesis in mind. But the combination of the right rock type, the right ecological context, the right temporal setting, and the specific Aboriginal traditions about underground passages associated with the gorge makes it a location worth investigating. It is the kind of place where the geology and the tradition and the hypothesis converge in a way that suggests there might be something there, something underground, waiting for the right question to be asked of it. The Jawoyn tradition about Bula is relevant here in another way. Bula is not simply a benign spirit. Bula is a powerful and potentially dangerous being, associated with creative and destructive forces, particularly with the power of lightning and underground energy. The stories about Bula are not casual or decorative. They carry moral weight. They describe consequences for those who fail to respect the underground spaces and the forces associated with them. In practical terms, these traditions function as warnings about specific locations that are geologically unstable or where underground water or gas presents real hazards. But they also reflect a deeper understanding of the underground world as a domain of power, a place where the ordinary rules of the surface world do not apply in the same way. This understanding of the underground as a different kind of space, a space with different rules and different inhabitants, is widespread in Australian Aboriginal traditions and is in some ways mirrored in the physical reality of underground environments. Underground spaces genuinely are different from surface environments. The temperature is constant. The humidity is typically higher. The light is absent except where it is brought in from outside. The sound behaves differently, with some frequencies absorbed by the rock and others amplified or channeled in unexpected ways. The absence of wind means that smells linger and accumulate rather than dispersing. An animal accustomed to surface conditions entering an underground passage for the first time would encounter a world that is genuinely alien by the standards of its ordinary experience. For human beings visiting underground spaces, the effect is similarly disorienting and powerful. The cave art of Europe, which we now know was made in spaces that required hours of underground travel to reach, was almost certainly produced in conditions of significant sensory alteration. The darkness, the confinement, the constant temperature, the peculiar acoustics, all of these would have affected the state of consciousness of the people who made the art in ways that are difficult to characterize precisely, but that may have been intentional. If the underground spaces of Australia were used in similar ways, as places of ceremony, of initiation, of deliberate alteration of ordinary consciousness, then the traditions about those spaces are not simply cultural memory of extinct animals. They are also the record of a relationship between human beings and the underground world that was complex and intentional and meaningful in ways that we are only beginning to appreciate. Consider the acoustics more carefully for a moment. Underground spaces, particularly those with specific geometries, can have extraordinary acoustic properties. Limestone caves are well known for this. Some cave chambers produce resonance at frequencies that have specific physiological effects, creating sensations of vibration in the body, altered breathing patterns, changes in the perception of space and time. Researchers studying the cave art of Europe have found that in many cases the locations of the most elaborate paintings correlate with the locations of the most unusual acoustic properties. The artists chose to paint where the sound was strange. Whether this was intentional or whether it was a consequence of the altered states of consciousness that the acoustic conditions helped produce is impossible to determine, but the correlation is real and it is striking. The Australian tunnel formations that are genuinely tubular in their geometry, with consistent circular cross sections extending for considerable distances, would have particular acoustic properties. A tunnel with smooth walls and a consistent diameter functions as a waveguide for sound, channeling certain frequencies with very little absorption and producing standing waves at frequencies determined by the tunnel's dimensions. A person inside such a tunnel producing sounds, whether voice or percussion or breathing, would hear those sounds return to them in ways that are qualitatively different from ordinary above ground experience. The effect would be intensified if the tunnel extends for many meters, and if the walls are smooth and hard, as the Paleoburrow walls appear to be. Whether Aboriginal Australians use these specific formations for ceremonial purposes in ways related to their acoustic properties is not documented in any source I have access to, but it is not implausible. The traditions associating underground passages with powerful and potentially dangerous forces, with the creative energies of the dreamtime, with the presence of beings that do not inhabit the surface world, are entirely consistent with the kind of experience that unusual acoustic environments can produce. And if those traditions were originally developed in response to specific acoustic experiences in specific underground locations, they would be a form of knowledge about the physical properties of those locations transmitted in a form that has proved durable enough to survive for tens of thousands of years. The durability of oral traditions is itself a subject that rewards careful attention. Western science was slow to take oral tradition seriously as a form of evidence about the physical world, partly because of a general cultural assumption that written records are more reliable than spoken ones. But research on specific oral traditions has repeatedly found that they can preserve accurate information about physical events and physical features over timescales that are quite remarkable by the standards of written records. The Aboriginal oral traditions that accurately describe coastlines submerged by sea level rise at the end of the last ice age are perhaps the most dramatic example. The sea level rise that closed off the land bridges and inundated the continental shelves of Australia happened approximately 10,000 years ago. The traditions that describe specific features of the landscape before that inundation are therefore at least 10,000 years old, and possibly older if the traditions were preserved through periods when those coastlines were not directly accessible. 10,000 years is not the full span of Aboriginal history in Australia. The continent was first inhabited at least 65,000 years ago and possibly earlier. Traditions that are 10,000 years old are within the relatively recent portion of that history. Traditions that describe encounters with the Pleistocene megafauna, which went extinct perhaps 45 to 50,000 years ago, would need to have been preserved for an order of magnitude longer. Whether oral traditions can maintain accurate information across that kind of time scale is genuinely uncertain. The mechanisms that preserve oral traditions accurately over long periods include the use of rhythmic and melodic structures that make deviation from the received form detectable, the requirement that traditions be validated by elders before being transmitted further, the embedding of specific information within narrative frameworks that give the information emotional and cultural significance, and the repeated transmission across many generations in many different contexts. All of these mechanisms are present in Aboriginal Australian traditions. Whether they are sufficient to maintain accuracy across 50,000 years is a question that has no definitive answer. But consider what it would mean if some of those traditions are 50,000 years old. It would mean that human beings in Australia have been transmitting knowledge continuously for a span of time that is approximately 10 times as long as the entire span of recorded human history in the rest of the world. It would mean that the Dreamtime stories told today carry within them the traces of a world that no living person has seen, a world of enormous animals and different climates and different ecologies, preserved in the amber of cultural memory in a form that has been accessible to every generation of human beings in Australia since the megafauna walked the land. That is an extraordinary thing. It is, if true, one of the greatest intellectual achievements in the history of our species. And the evidence that at least some of it is true, that at least some of the traditions accurately describe physical features of the world as it was thousands or tens of thousands of years ago, is accumulating. The tunnels are part of that picture, not the whole picture, and perhaps not even the most important part, but they are there in the rock, and they are asking the question that every mystery asks. What do you know? What can you find out? How far back can you see? Let us move now to the western end of the continent, to the red country of Western Australia, which is a different kind of ancient from the ancient of Queensland or New South Wales. Western Australia contains some of the oldest geological formations exposed anywhere on Earth. The Pilbara region in the northwest of the state has rocks that are more than 3 billion years old. Rocks that formed before complex life existed on Earth, before the oceans had their current chemistry, before the atmosphere had its current composition. Standing on those ancient rocks in the Pilbara, looking out over a landscape that has barely changed in its broad outlines for hundreds of millions of years, you have an almost physical sense of being a very recent thing in a very old world. The underground world of the Pilbara has its own character. The ancient rocks of the region have been folded and faulted and metamorphosed through such extreme conditions over such vast timescales that they contain structures and formations of extraordinary complexity. The banded iron formations of the Pilbara, which are among the most economically significant geological features in Australia because they contain enormous quantities of iron ore, are also among the most visually striking. The alternating bands of iron-rich and iron-poor rock laid down in shallow seas more than 2.5 billion years ago record in their chemistry the history of the Earth's early atmosphere, the transition from an oxygen-poor to an oxygen-rich world that happened when cyanobacteria began producing oxygen through photosynthesis on a massive scale. The Pilbara banded iron formations are a record of one of the most significant events in the history of life on Earth, written in rock that predates the existence of any plant or animal. Within this ancient terrain, underground spaces have a different character from those found in the sandstone and limestone formations of eastern Australia. The Pilbara rocks are hard, much harder than sandstone, and the formation of significant underground passages in them by either geological or biological processes is more difficult. What the Pilbara does contain, however, is an extensive system of underground water channels. Channels that move through fractures and fault zones in the hard rock and that maintain water in the dry landscape in ways that are critical for the ecosystem above. The specialized invertebrate fauna that lives in these underground water systems, the stygofauna, are among the most scientifically interesting organisms in Australia. Species of blind shrimps and blind aquatic insects that have lived in complete darkness in the underground water of the Pilbara for millions of years, evolving in isolation from the surface world to become forms that have no close equivalents anywhere else on Earth. The stygofauna of the Pilbara are relevant to our story, not because they have anything to do with the tunnel formations or with the megafauna, but because they illustrate a principle that is central to understanding what the underground world of Australia actually is. It is not empty. It is not simply the absence of the surface world. It is a world in its own right, inhabited by life forms specifically adapted to its conditions, organized around resources and ecological relationships that are entirely different from anything on the surface, and existing on timescales and in states of isolation that make it, in effect, a separate evolutionary universe. If the underground world of Australia has been inhabited by specialized stygofauna for millions of years, and if the large marsupials of the Pleistocene had the behavioral and anatomical capacity for burrowing, then the Pleistocene underground of Australia was a biologically rich environment in ways we have barely begun to document. The tunnels that the megafauna may have made were not bored through an inert and empty medium. They were bored through a world that was already inhabited, already structured, already functional as a biological community. The megafauna that used the underground passages were entering a world with its own history, its own ecology, its own specific characteristics. What did the Diprotodon find when it pushed underground? What did it smell in the cool darkness? What sounds reached it in the muffled acoustic world of the rock? We cannot know these things. The Diprotodon is gone. Its sensory experience is as inaccessible to us as the experience of any being separated from us by 45,000 years of extinction. But the rock in which it moved is still there, and the traces of its passage are still there, and the underground world it entered is still there, changed in its biology and its hydrology since the Pleistocene, but continuous with the world that existed then in the way that the physical structure of the earth is always continuous with its own past. There is something here that deserves to be said slowly and clearly. The underground world of Australia is one of the most poorly understood biological and geological environments on this continent. It has been studied and it is being studied, but the resources available for underground scientific investigation are small relative to the scale of the environment and the complexity of the questions it raises. There are known to be thousands of kilometers of underground passages and chambers in Australian cave systems that have never been entered by human beings. There are aquifer systems whose three-dimensional structure is known only through modeling and inference. There are biological communities in the underground water of the Australian interior that have not been described by science because no one has yet been to the locations where they live. In that context, the discovery of additional paleoburrow formations, or the demonstration that known formations are paleoburrows, is not a minor addition to Australian paleontology. It is a window into an entire aspect of Pleistocene Australia that has not previously been visible. The behavior of the megafauna at the surface has been inferred from skeletal remains and from the ecological modeling of the landscapes they inhabited. The behavior of the megafauna underground has barely been considered because the underground as an environment has barely been considered. The paleoburrow hypothesis, if it holds up to continued investigation, opens the underground world as a dimension of Pleistocene ecology that was previously invisible, and it raises questions that go further than simply what made the tunnels. It raises questions about the ecology of the Pleistocene underground in ways that connect to questions about extinction. If large burrowing marsupials used underground spaces as refugia during periods of climate stress, as places to shelter from extreme heat or drought, then the capacity to burrow may have been, at some point in the Pleistocene, a meaningful survival advantage. And the loss of that capacity in the megafauna that went extinct, whether through changes in behavior, loss of habitat, or simply the irreversible process of population collapse, may have reduced their ability to cope with the conditions that ultimately ended their existence. The extinction of the Australian megafauna is one of the most debated topics in paleontology and archaeology. The two main hypotheses, climate change and human hunting, have been argued about for decades, and the evidence for each has grown more complex as more data has accumulated. The current consensus, to the extent that one exists, suggests that both factors played a role and that the interaction between them may have been more important than either factor alone. A population of large herbivores that was already stressed by climate variability may have been unable to cope with even modest additional pressure from human hunting. A population that was well within its carrying capacity under stable conditions may have been pushed past a tipping point by the combination of habitat change and increased mortality. The underground dimension of this extinction story is unexplored. If some megafauna species used underground passages as refugia, those passages may have represented a buffer against surface conditions that helped maintain populations through periods of climate stress. The loss of those refugia through either geological change or the direct disturbance of underground spaces by newly arrived human populations could have contributed to the vulnerability of the megafauna at the time of extinction. This is speculative in a field that is already full of competing speculations, but it is a speculation that follows logically from the paleoburrow hypothesis, and that deserves attention as the evidence for that hypothesis grows. Human beings arrived in Australia during a period of significant climate variability. The period between 65 and 50,000 years ago included both wet and dry phases in different parts of the continent, and the megafauna populations were likely stressed by these changes in various ways. The arrival of a new predator, even a relatively inefficient one by the standards of the later human hunting technologies that would be developed, added a new source of mortality to populations that were already managing the challenges of a changing environment. And if those populations depended partly on underground refugia to survive periods of environmental stress, and if the new human arrivals disturbed or occupied those refugia, the combination of pressures could have been decisive. Again, this is speculation, but it is the kind of speculation that the physical evidence of the tunnels makes possible, and that would not be possible without the tunnels. Every mystery that the tunnels raise, every question that their existence forces us to ask about the Pleistocene ecology of Australia, is a question that adds to our understanding of the world that preceded the one we live in. And the more we understand about that world, the more clearly we see the one we are in. Because the present is always built on the past, always carrying the consequences of what came before, always shaped by the creatures and the processes and the events that preceded the current moment by however many thousands or millions or billions of years. The Australian continent is 4.5 billion years old. The oldest rocks in the Pilbara have been on the surface for approximately 3 billion of those years. The animals that made the tunnels, if the Paleoburrow hypothesis is correct, lived between 200,000 and 45,000 years ago. The human beings who developed traditions about underground spaces and underground beings have been in Australia for at least 65,000 years. The European scientists who first found the bones and asked the first systematic questions about Australia's prehistoric life arrived approximately 200 years ago, and you, listening to this story in the dark, exist in this present moment, which is itself only the thinnest possible layer on top of all of that history. The scale of it is dizzying if you let yourself feel it. Most of us, most of the time, do not let ourselves feel it because it makes the ordinary concerns of daily life seem very small and the span of any individual life seem very brief. And these are not comfortable feelings to carry around in the middle of an ordinary day. But in the dark, before sleep, with the world quiet and the mind loosening its grip on the specific, the scale becomes something different. It becomes not dizzying but calming. The enormous span of time is not threatening. It is simply the context in which everything happens, the medium through which all of history moves, the background against which the tunnels and the animals and the people and the stories and the science all appear, each in its moment, each leaving its trace. The rock does not experience time the way living things do. The rock does not experience time at all, in any sense that we would recognize. It simply is, and it holds, and it changes over timescales so vast that the human nervous system cannot perceive the change directly. What we see when we look at the rock is a frozen moment in a process of change that has been proceeding for billions of years and will proceed for billions more. The tunnels we have been discussing are themselves just a frozen moment. They were made during a brief period in the deep history of the continent, made by creatures that existed for a moment in geological terms and then were gone. And the tunnels they left have been sitting in the rock ever since, not changing in any significant way, waiting for whoever might come to ask what they are. They are answers to questions we did not know we were asking. They are the landscape answering back, offering information about its own history in the only language it has, which is the language of shape and surface and the specific character of the marks that different forces leave in different materials over different amounts of time. Learning to read that language is what geology and paleontology and archaeology are at their core about. And Aboriginal ecological knowledge, transmitted through tens of thousands of years of careful observation and careful transmission, is another way of reading the same language. The methods are different. The institutional frameworks are different. The vocabulary is different, but the project is the same: to understand the world as it actually is, including the parts of it that are not immediately visible, including the parts of it that require going underground, in some sense or another, to find. Let the picture settle now: the tunnels in the rock, the animals that may have made them, the people who came after and found the tunnels and understood them in their own way, the scientists who came after that and are asking carefully and provisionally whether what they see in the rock is what it appears to be. The knowledge that flows between these different ways of knowing, imperfectly and sometimes awkwardly but persistently. The underground world of Australia, unexplored and full of what it holds. Outside, wherever you are, the night is doing what it does. The world is turning. The stars that Aboriginal Australians have been reading for 65,000 years are moving slowly across the sky, and somewhere in the red country of Australia's interior, in a place where no light reaches, in a passage that has been smooth and dark and silent for tens of thousands of years, the stone is holding the shape of something that was once alive. Hold that image as you drift. The smoothed walls, the parallel scratch marks, the darkness that is older than any memory, the rock that does not forget. It is enough. The story has been told, the mystery has been named, the sleep is coming. Australia is ancient and it is patient and it is full of things it has not yet shown us. And tonight, that is a comfort rather than a challenge. Let the ancient continent hold what it holds. Let the underground world be what it is. Let the questions rest until morning. You're here, and the world is old, and the dark is good. Rest now, deep and slow. The tunnels are there. The rock is there. The question is there. And the morning, when it comes, will find them all exactly as they were. Sleep. There is a particular quality to the silence of the Australian bush at night that is unlike any other silence on earth. It is not the silence of absence. If you sit still long enough in the scrub or the mulga or the spinifex and simply listen, you begin to hear what the silence actually contains. The calling of nightjars, distant and rhythmic, a sound so repetitive it becomes almost mechanical, almost geological in its patience. The scratch of small creatures moving through dry leaf litter, each rustle distinct and then gone. The periodic crack of a eucalyptus branch releasing heat accumulated through the long hours of the day. And beneath all of that, if the night is calm enough and you are still enough, a kind of breath that seems to come from the earth itself, a very low, very slow movement of air that has no obvious source and no obvious direction. That breath from the earth is not imagination, it is a real phenomenon. Underground spaces, particularly those with multiple openings, exchange air with the surface as temperature and pressure differentials shift between day and night. The air inside the underground passages warms slightly during the day and cools at night, creating very gentle but measurable flows at the entrances. If you sit beside the opening of a cave or an underground passage in the cool of a desert night, you will feel that air moving past you, emerging from the underground world into the surface world, with the consistent temperature and the specific mineral smell of deep rock. It is not unpleasant. It is simply different. It is the signature of the underground world making itself briefly perceptible to anyone patient enough to notice. Ancient peoples noticed. Of course they did. The ancient peoples of Australia were among the most perceptive human observers of the natural world in the history of our species. They needed to be in an environment as demanding as the Australian interior, in a landscape where the resources for human survival were real, but required enormous skill and knowledge to find and use. The capacity to notice things, to pay attention to the subtle signals that the environment produced, was not merely useful. It was the difference between surviving and not surviving, between raising children who survived and watching them die of thirst or heat or the wrong plant mistakenly eaten. The observations that Aboriginal Australians made of their environment and the systems they developed for storing and transmitting those observations across generations represent an investment of human cognitive capacity and human attention that is difficult to overstate. When an elder of the Fidjantjatjara people, whose country lies in the extreme arid zone of Central Australia, describes the location of a hidden water source in terms of the specific configuration of the landscape around it, the specific plants that grow near it, The specific time of year when it can be expected to be reliable, that description is not casual. It is the distilled product of thousands of observations made by hundreds of people across many generations, organized into a framework that allows anyone who has received the relevant transmission to find water in a place where water is not obviously present. The precision of this knowledge, tested repeatedly against the reality of survival in the desert, is of a different order from what casual observation produces. The same quality of observation that generates reliable knowledge about desert water sources generates reliable knowledge about other features of the landscape, including underground features. The underground world of Australia is not separable in the ecological understanding of Aboriginal Australians from the surface world. It is another dimension of the same landscape, differently accessible but equally real, equally significant, equally available to observation and knowledge if the right methods are applied. The right methods include not just direct physical exploration, but also indirect observation. The behavior of animals that use underground spaces, the specific character of surface depressions that indicate underground chambers, the particular vegetation that grows over underground water, the sounds and air movements that emerge from underground passages, the quality of the light in certain locations at certain times of year. All of this observational knowledge, maintained and transmitted across thousands of years, makes the Aboriginal traditions about specific underground locations in Australia not merely cultural artifacts, but a form of geological and ecological survey conducted across an enormous span of time by an enormous number of observers. When those traditions consistently identify specific locations as having underground significance, the consistency itself is evidence. It means that something at those locations has been persistently observable enough across enough generations to be incorporated into a transmission system that is designed to preserve accurate information. The specific underground formations we have been discussing, the smooth-walled, rounded cross-section tunnels found in sandstone and other rock types across various parts of Australia, are in several cases located at places that have traditional significance in Aboriginal culture. The convergence is not universal, and it would be wrong to suggest that every traditional site has underground tunnels or that every underground tunnel formation is a traditional site. But the overlap is real enough to be notable, and it is the kind of overlap that becomes more interesting the more carefully it is examined. Let us spend some time in the Flinders Ranges of South Australia, because the Flinders Ranges are a place where the geological and the biological and the cultural all converge in ways that are particularly clear. The Flinders Ranges are a series of ancient, highly eroded mountain ranges running roughly north-south through the center of South Australia. Their quartzite and limestone peaks and ridges rising several hundred meters above the surrounding plains. The ranges are ancient in the geological sense, though not as ancient as the Pilbara. The main folding events that created their current structure happened roughly 500 million years ago during the Cambrian period, when the first complex animals were just beginning to appear in the Earth's oceans. The rock itself is older than that, in some cases considerably older. The Ediacaran fossils found in the Flinders Ranges are among the most significant paleontological discoveries of the 20th century. The Ediacaran biota, named for the Ediacara Hills in the northern Flinders Ranges where they were first documented, are the oldest known complex multicellular organisms on Earth, living between approximately 635 and 541 million years ago. They are not like any living organisms. They were soft-bodied creatures, some resembling fronds or discs or tubes, living on the seafloor of a shallow ocean that covered what is now the dry interior of South Australia. Their exact relationship to later life forms is still debated, but they are the first evidence in the fossil record of the kind of body-plan complexity that eventually produced all the animals and plants that exist today. Standing in the Flinders Ranges and knowing that the rock beneath your feet contains these ancient organisms is one of those experiences that deepens the ordinary meaning of words like old and ancient beyond recovery. The Diprotodon, whose possible paleoburrows we have been discussing, lived in the Flinders Ranges region during the Pleistocene. Its bones have been found there in significant quantities, and the landscape would have been attractive to a large grazing animal, with its mixture of grasslands and shrublands, and the permanent water of springs that emerge from the limestone in various parts of the range. But the Ediacaran organisms preserved in the Flinders Ranges limestone predate the Diprotodon by 500 million years. They predate all mammals by approximately 480 million years. They predate the first land plants by roughly 150 million years. The Diprotodon is a recent creature by the standards of the rock it lived on, and yet the Diprotodon's traces in that landscape, if the paleoburrow hypothesis is correct, are among the largest and most physically impressive things that any organism has ever left in the rock of the Flinders Ranges. The Ediacaran fossils are small and fragile, visible only if you know where to look and what you're looking for. The paleoburrows, if they are there, are human-scale structures, accessible to direct physical experience, tangible in a way that a microscopic fossil can never be. There is something vertiginous about this relationship. The most ancient traces are the most subtle, and the relatively recent traces are the ones that you can walk into. Deep time is counterintuitive in this way. It is not always the oldest things that leave the most visible marks. The Adnyamathanha people are the traditional custodians of the Flinders Ranges, and their name for their country translates roughly as rock or hills people, a name that speaks directly to the centrality of the geological landscape in their cultural identity. Their traditions about the ranges are deeply embedded in the physical character of the landscape, describing specific features in terms of dreaming narratives that explain both the origin of those features and the appropriate human relationship to them. The ranges themselves, in Adnyamathanha tradition, were formed by the activities of dreaming beings, and the specific shapes of particular hills and gorges and rock formations reflect the specific actions and experiences of those beings. Underground features are part of this tradition. Springs in the Flinders Ranges, of which there are many because the limestone karst of the ranges holds and releases water in complex ways, are particularly significant. They are understood as places where the underground world and the surface world meet, where the creative energy of the dreaming is present and accessible, and the passages that lead underground, whether natural caves or the more puzzling formations we have been discussing, are associated with beings that inhabit the boundary between the underground world and the surface world. There is a specific tradition in the Flinders Ranges about a creature called the Akura, a serpent of enormous size that is said to have moved through the landscape, creating the features of the ranges through its passage. The Akura is not a literal snake in the contemporary biological sense. It is a dreaming being with a serpentine form associated with water, with underground spaces, and with the creative power that shapes the landscape. In various Adnyamatana stories, the Kura enters the earth at specific locations, moving underground for distances that sometimes correspond roughly to the distances between surface features that are traditionally connected by its presence. The underground movement of the Akura creates passages that link the locations where it enters and emerges. Whether the Akura tradition is in some way related to the physical existence of underground passages in the Flinders Ranges limestone is a question that would require careful study of both the geological features and the traditional knowledge, conducted in collaboration with Adnyamathana knowledge holders, to begin to address. It is not a question with an obvious answer, and the tradition is not simply a geological description in narrative form. It is a complex cultural and spiritual framework for understanding the landscape that serves purposes beyond information storage. But the physical dimension of the tradition, the specific locations it identifies, and the underground movements it describes, is relevant to understanding the underground geology of the ranges in ways that straightforward geological survey might miss. This is the broader point that deserves to be made clearly and carefully, because it is easy to either overstate or understate it. The relationship between Aboriginal traditional knowledge and scientific understanding of Australian geology and paleontology is not a relationship in which one system simply confirms or corrects the other. They are different systems with different purposes and different methods and different frameworks for what knowledge is and what it is for. But they are both responding to the same physical reality. And in places where they converge, where the traditions and the geology are describing the same features from different directions, the convergence is genuinely informative. It suggests that both systems have independently found something real, and that the reality they are both finding is more interesting and more complex than either could show alone. The tunnels are a place where this convergence is particularly striking. The physical evidence of smooth-walled, rounded passages in Australian rock is real and documented and resistant to simple geological explanation in some cases. The Aboriginal traditions about underground passages and the beings that inhabit them are ancient and geographically widespread and consistent in their attribution of specific locations as having underground significance. The paleoburrow hypothesis offers a biological explanation for the physical evidence that is consistent with what we know about Australia's extinct megafauna and about the burrowing behavior of related animals. And the traditions about underground beings, when examined carefully and charitably, are consistent with what we would expect from a people who had observed the behavior of large burrowing animals in this landscape across tens of thousands of years. None of this proves anything definitively. The scientific investigation of the Australian paleoburrow hypothesis is still in its early stages, and much of the physical evidence remains ambiguous. The relationship between the physical evidence and the traditional knowledge is suggestive rather than conclusive. The extinction of the megafauna remains one of the great unresolved debates in Australian science. But the picture that is emerging, piece by piece and question by question, is a picture of a continent whose underground world was, for hundreds of thousands of years, a living environment inhabited by creatures we can barely imagine, Creatures whose traces are still present in the rock if we know how to look for them. And that picture is not finished. It is still being painted slowly by the people who go underground with their torches and their measuring equipment and their questions, by the people who sit with elders and listen carefully to traditions that are older than any institution on earth, by the people who look at satellite images of the Australian surface and see in the gentle depressions in the ground the signatures of what lies below. Each small addition to the picture is significant, not because it resolves the whole, but because it makes the whole more visible. You can contribute to this picture simply by knowing it exists. The Australian Paleoburrow mystery is not widely known, even in Australia, and awareness is the first condition of investigation. Every person who knows that these formations exist and that the questions about them are unresolved is a potential contributor to the process of asking the right questions and looking in the right places. Science is not the activity of a small number of professional researchers working in isolation. It is a collective activity, and the collective includes everyone who pays attention and asks questions and shares what they find. But this is not the time for action. This is the time for knowing, which is a different and quieter thing. Knowing that the tunnels are there, that the mystery is real, that the continent beneath you is older and fuller and stranger than the surface suggests, that the underground world is as alive with history as the surface world, if not more so, because the underground changes more slowly and holds what the surface loses to erosion and weather and the passage of time. Knowing that somewhere in Australia, right now, in the constant darkness of a passage that was shaped by something enormous and warm-blooded and purposeful, the rock is doing what rock does, which is nothing and everything, which is holding, which is being the medium through which the past becomes accessible to the present. The sky is very big in Australia. Even in the cities, which are themselves mostly concentrated on the thin coastal rim of the continent, you sense on clear nights the enormous space above you that the outback sky makes so dramatically visible. In the interior, where the cities do not reach and the light does not reach, the sky at night is a presence rather than just a background, dense with stars and structured by the sweep of the Milky Way in ways that feel almost architectural. The Aboriginal astronomical tradition that developed under that sky over 65,000 years is the oldest astronomical tradition on Earth, and it is still alive, still being practiced, still being transmitted to new generations of Australians who learn to read the sky with the same precision and the same purpose that their ancestors brought to it. What connects the sky to the underground tunnels? Tonight, in the story we have been following, is not any direct relationship between astronomy and geology, though those connections exist in various technical ways. What connects them is the quality of attention that both require and that both reward. The sky rewards patient, systematic, long-term attention. The underground rewards patient, careful, willing to go into difficult places attention. Both are there, always, available to anyone who brings the right quality of observation, and both, when observed carefully across sufficient time, reveal a world that is immensely older and more complex than the ordinary surface of daily experience suggests. The Aboriginal Australians who developed the traditions about underground beings and the traditions about the emu in the sky and the traditions about underground water and the traditions about the seasonal movements of animals and the traditions about the song lines that connect all of these things were practicing a form of integrated ecological science that held together aspects of the world that our own scientific specializations tend to separate. the sky and the underground and the surface and the biological and the geological and the cultural were not different domains requiring different experts. They were different dimensions of a single landscape that required a single integrated understanding. That integration is something that modern science is slowly working its way back toward through the idea of systems ecology and through the recognition that the boundaries between disciplines are often arbitrary impositions rather than reflections of actual divisions in nature. The underground world is not separate from the surface world. The paleontology of extinct animals is not separate from the ecology of living ones. The geological history of the continent is not separate from its biological history. The cultural knowledge of the people who have lived in the landscape is not separate from the scientific knowledge of the people who study it from outside. All of these things are different aspects of one reality, and the tunnels in the Australian rock, smooth and rounded, and marked with the parallel lines of claws that no longer exist, are a place where many of these aspects converge. They are geological formations, they are biological traces, they are cultural landmarks, they are windows into deep time. They are physical evidence of a world that existed before human beings arrived in Australia, and that human beings, when they arrived, found and named and incorporated into their understanding of the landscape and of the deep creative forces that shaped it. They are also simply and finally beautiful, not in the way that the surface of Australia is beautiful, which is a beauty of vast spaces and dramatic colors, and the specific quality of light in a dry inland landscape, but beautiful in the way that deep things are beautiful, things that reveal more the longer you look at them, things that are not exhausted by the first or second or 10th encounter, things that connect to the full depth of what they represent rather than simply presenting a surface. The tunnels in the rock are the past made tangible. They are the underground world made accessible. They are the mystery made physical. And there is beauty in all of that. The beauty of the genuine, the beauty of something real that resists easy understanding and rewards patient attention. Pay attention. The story is not finished. The investigation is not complete. The knowledge that Aboriginal Australians hold about the underground world of this continent has not been fully heard by the scientific community, and the scientific knowledge of the underground world of this continent has not been fully integrated into our understanding of Australia's past. Both processes are ongoing, both are necessary, and together they will, in time, produce a picture of the underground Australia that is as rich and as complex as the surface Australia that everyone can see. But not tonight. Tonight, the picture is as it is, incomplete and therefore alive with possibility, full of questions that the rock has not yet fully answered, and that is enough. Incompleteness is not failure. It is the state of all honest inquiry. It is the acknowledgement that the world is larger than any single moment of understanding, that there is always more to find out, that the mystery does not diminish with investigation, but only becomes more interesting, more detailed, more connected to the other mysteries that surround it. The tunnels are in the rock, and the rock is patient, and the night is long and deep. Somewhere far to the south, the Southern Cross is climbing in the sky. The same stars that Aboriginal Australians have been navigating by for tens of thousands of years. The same stars that look down on the pale sandstone and the red earth and the hidden passages below. The night is old and the land is old, and you are, in the full context of this story, very new. A brief presence in a landscape whose history extends in every direction, far beyond what any individual life can encompass. That brevity is not cause for despair, it is a form of belonging. To be brief in a long story is still to be part of the story. The Diprotodon was brief by geological standards, and yet it left passages in the rock that have outlasted it by 45,000 years. The Aboriginal Australians who developed the traditions about underground beings were each individually brief, and yet the knowledge they contributed to has been continuously alive for 65,000 years. The researchers who first found the underground formations and began asking systematic questions about them were brief, and the questions they asked are still being asked and will continue to be asked long after they are gone. You, listening to this story in the dark, are brief, but you have heard the story and something of it will remain with you, and something of what remains with you may find its way into the world in some form that matters, however small. That is how knowledge travels. That is how understanding grows. Not in dramatic revelations, but in the slow accumulation of attention, one person at a time, each carrying a fragment of the picture forward. The rock holds what it holds. The darkness holds what it holds. The ancient continent holds everything it has been given across 4.5 billion years, and it will hold it for as long as rock endures, which is longer than any of us need to think about tonight. Let the thought of the tunnels carry you down now into the dark that is cool and quiet and older than any memory. The smooth walls, the parallel marks, the constant temperature, the silence that is not absence but presence, the presence of all the years that the rock has held its shape and kept its record and waited for whoever might come to ask what it means. You know what it means now, or you know the beginning of what it means, which is enough. The rest will wait. The stone is patient. The underground world is there, exactly as it has always been, asking its questions in the only language it has, the language of shape and depth and the enduring record of what was once alive. And now you can be still. The story is complete enough for tonight. The mystery is named. The wonder is acknowledged. The ancient continent is doing what ancient continents do, which is simply being what they are. In the dark, in the silence, patient beyond any patience that a living thing can fully understand. Sleep now, slow and deep and easy. The tunnels are there, the rock is there, the stars are there, and the night is good and long and old and full of what it holds. Drift, the Australian dark is receiving you. The deep time is always there, and in the morning the questions will still be there too, bright and interesting and alive, ready for another day of patient attention. But for now, only this, the weight of the blanket, the sound of breathing, the enormous quiet of the sleeping world. And somewhere far beneath the red earth, in the cool and the dark and the forever of stone, the smooth walls of something ancient, holding the shape of something gone, patient as only the earth can be patient. Rest, the continent is old, the night is safe, and sleep is coming, easy and deep, carrying you down into the dark the way water finds its way through limestone, quietly and without effort, following the passage that was made for it. Sleep. Sleep now. The tunnels are there. Sleep. There is a specific quality of darkness that exists only underground. It is not the darkness of a room with the lights off, where the eyes adjust and the faint ambient light of the outside world finds its way in under doors and around curtains and through the thin membranes of walls that are never truly opaque. It is not the darkness of a moonless night outdoors, where the sky itself offers a residue of light from stars and from the reflected glow of distant cities. Underground darkness is absolute. It is the darkness that existed before there was any light at all, a darkness that the rock has held continuously since it was formed, broken only when a living thing carrying fire or electric illumination passes through and then restores as soon as that light is withdrawn. The darkness of underground spaces is not the absence of something, it is a presence in its own right. A quality of the space that is as real and as physical as the temperature or the humidity or the specific mineral smell of deep rock. Animals that live permanently underground have evolved in response to that darkness over many millions of years. The stygofauna of the Australian underground water systems, which we mentioned earlier, are among the most dramatic examples of this evolutionary adaptation. Blind shrimps, blind beetles, blind fish, organisms whose eyes have either been lost entirely or reduced to vestigial structures that serve no visual function. Because in complete darkness, the energy invested in maintaining visual organs is wasted. What replaces sight in these organisms is an extreme sensitivity to mechanical vibrations in the water, to chemical gradients, to the precise architecture of us passages and chambers through which they move. They navigate their world not by seeing it, but by feeling it, by sensing the specific character of the water and the rock as it changes around them. For a large terrestrial animal using an underground burrow system, the adaptation to darkness would be different. A wombat or a diprotodon-like animal using tunnels as a refuge or a den would not be a permanent underground dweller in the way that the stygofauna are. It would move between the surface world and the underground world, and its sensory systems would need to function in both environments. What changes when you enter a tunnel is the relative importance of different senses. Sight, which dominates above ground, becomes less useful as the light fades. Smell, which is less immediately prominent in an open landscape, becomes much more significant in a confined passage where scent accumulates and concentrates. Hearing, which in an open landscape must compete with the wide-ranging sounds of a complex acoustic environment, becomes sharper and more spatially precise in a tunnel where sounds are channeled and reflected in specific ways. The experience of entering a tunnel for any large mammal is a transition between two different sensory worlds, and the transition would have been as significant for a Pleistocene marsupial as it is for a modern wombat or for a human being crawling into a cave with a headlamp. The underground world is not simply a darker version of the surface world, it is organized differently. The landmarks are different, the signals are different, the dangers are different, and the competence required to navigate it effectively is different from the competence required for surface living. A lineage of animals that developed genuine competence in the underground world, that passed that competence across generations through both genetic inheritance and behavioral learning, would have access to resources and refugia that surface-only animals could not reach. In a variable and sometimes harsh climate, that access could have been a significant advantage, and the degree to which that advantage was realized would have depended on the degree to which the underground competence was maintained and developed across generations. This is the evolutionary logic that underlies the paleoburrow hypothesis in its deepest form. Not just that large animals happen to dig tunnels, but that the capacity to dig and use tunnels was selected for over many generations because it provided access to a dimension of the environment that offered specific and consistent advantages. And the result of that selection, over hundreds of thousands of years, would have been the kind of systematic and extensive tunnel networks that would leave behind the formations we are now finding in the rock. There are several locations in Australia where the evidence for paleoburrow type formations is stronger than in others, and it is worth spending some time with the specific physical characteristics of these locations before we close this part of the story. The sandstone country of the central Queensland coast between Rockhampton and Mackay contains sections of Permian sandstone that are several hundred million years old and that have been subjected to the kind of weathering and erosion that can produce complex underground features. Within this country, there are locations where researchers have documented tunnel-like formations with the smooth interior surfaces and consistent dimensions that are characteristic of the possible paleoburrows. The sandstone in these areas is relatively soft, softer than the quartzite of the Pilbara or the granite of some other parts of Queensland. And it is the kind of material that a large clawed animal could potentially work through over extended periods. The specific formations in the central Queensland sandstone are in several cases associated with the presence of natural water, either as seeps from the sandstone face or as springs emerging from the base of sandstone outcrops. The Burdekin River catchment, which drains a large section of central Queensland into the sea near Bowen, contains limestone karst formations in its upper reaches that are known to be associated with extensive underground cave systems, and the margins of these known cave systems include sandstone areas where the less formally documented tunnel formations occur. A researcher who spent several field seasons in the central Queensland interior documented a series of these formations in the 1990s and early 2000s. Her field notes, which have not been formally published but are held at a regional university archive, describe the dimensions and internal characteristics of more than a dozen formations with some care. The most extensive of the formations she documented extended approximately 60 meters into a sandstone cliff face, maintained a consistent diameter of approximately 1.5 meters for most of its length, and displayed on its interior walls a set of parallel grooves running in the direction of the tunnel axis. The grooves were between 3 and 8 millimeters wide and between 1 and 3 millimeters deep, and they were spaced at intervals of between 20 and 40 millimeters across the full circumference of the tunnel walls. Her field notes described the effect of these grooves as similar to the surface of a very large clawback, as if something had been pressed against the wall while moving forward and had left the marks of its claws along the full width of whatever surface pressed against the stone. She did not publish these observations formally because she was unable to determine to her own satisfaction whether the grooves were biological in origin or were the result of a geological process she was not familiar with. The formations she described are consistent with what would be predicted for the marks left by a large mammal with curved claws moving through a confined passage, but they are also potentially consistent with certain geological processes involving differential weathering along structural features in the sandstone. Without more detailed analysis of the mineralogy and the structural geology of formation, she felt she could not distinguish between these possibilities. Her notes represent one instance of a more general pattern. There are researchers across Australia who have encountered formations that they could not easily explain by conventional geological processes, who have noted the characteristics of those formations carefully, and who have not published their observations because the evidence was ambiguous and the available explanatory frameworks were inadequate. The Paleoburrow hypothesis, which was formally proposed primarily in the context of South American formations, gives those existing observations a new context within which to be re-examined and potentially published. The process of scientific knowledge accumulation is not always linear. Sometimes a new hypothesis allows evidence that was always there to be recognized as evidence and to become useful in ways it could not be useful before. The convergence of the South American Paleoburrow documentation with the Australian unexplained formations is one of those moments where a new hypothesis creates a new framework for existing observations. Whether the Australian formations will ultimately be confirmed as paleoburrows, attributed to geological processes, or explained by something else entirely, is a question for future investigation. But the question itself is being asked more seriously now than it was a decade ago. And the people asking it have better tools and better frameworks than their predecessors. Remote sensing technology has transformed the investigation of underground features in Australia over the past 20 years. Ground-penetrating radar, which can image underground structures to depths of several meters from the surface, has been used in various archaeological and geological investigations in Australia and has produced results that are sometimes striking. In some locations, the ground-penetrating radar data shows subsurface features that are not immediately explicable in geological terms. Features with the kind of regularity and consistent dimensions that might indicate either artificial structures or biological formations. Interpreting these data requires careful geological context and ideally corroboration from direct investigation, but they provide a means of identifying locations where direct investigation is most likely to be productive. Satellite imaging of the Australian surface has also revealed features that were not visible before satellite data was available. The subtle depressions that indicate underground voids show up clearly in high-resolution digital elevation models derived from satellite data. These depressions, mapped across large areas, reveal patterns in the distribution of underground features that would take years of ground-level survey to identify. Some of these patterns align with the distribution of known geological formations. Others align with the distribution of traditional cultural sites, and some align with what would be predicted for the distribution of paleoburrow networks if large burrowing animals had used certain areas of the landscape intensively over long periods. This is early stage work. The interpretations are provisional and the data are still being collected and analyzed. But the trajectory is clear. The tools for investigating the underground Australia are improving rapidly. And the questions that can be asked with those tools are becoming more specific and more answerable. The next decade will likely see significant advances in the understanding of both the geological and the biological history of the Australian underground. For the purposes of this story, the important thing is not the specific findings that will emerge from that investigation. The important thing is the question itself, the recognition that the underground world of Australia is a significant and poorly understood dimension of the continent's history, and that understanding it better will change what we know about the ecological past of Australia in ways that are likely to be genuinely surprising. The history of Australian science is a history of surprises. The discovery that Australia had been continuously inhabited for 65,000 years was a surprise. The discovery of the Ediacaran fauna was a surprise. The discovery of the specific characteristics of Australian megafauna was a surprise. The recognition that the Great Artesian Basin is one of the world's largest aquifer systems was a surprise. Australian geology and biology consistently turn out to be stranger and more extraordinary than the available frameworks predict. There is no reason to believe that the underground biology and geology of Australia will be any different. Whatever the investigation ultimately reveals, whether it confirms the Paleoburrow hypothesis in some form or reveals something entirely different, the revelation will be worth the effort of finding it. This is a country that rewards patience and careful attention with discoveries that no amount of theoretical reasoning could have predicted. The dark country of the Australian underground is waiting. It has been waiting for a very long time, since before human beings arrived in Australia, since before the megafauna went extinct, since before the sandstone and the limestone and the granite were formed from the materials that eventually became them. It is not impatient, it is not reluctant, it simply is, exactly as it has always been, holding what it holds, offering its surfaces to whoever comes with a torch and a question, and the willingness to go deep enough into the dark to find what is there. And what is there, or what may be there, is the shape of something enormous and long extinct, preserved in the rock of the oldest continent, waiting to tell us what we do not yet know about the world that preceded ours. That is the story of the Australian tunnels. That is why they matter, and that is why if you find yourself in the Australian interior someday, it is worth looking not just at the surface, magnificent as it is, but also at the places where the surface opens and offers access to what lies below. The earth is generous with those who pay attention. It gives up its secrets slowly and incompletely, but it gives them. The tunnels in the rock are one of those gifts, offered to anyone willing to ask the question that the rock has been waiting to answer. What made this? And the answer, partial and provisional, and still being refined, is something alive, something enormous, something that moved through the dark of the ancient Australian underground for hundreds of thousands of years and left the shape of its passage into patient rock. That is enough to know for tonight. Let it be enough. Let the image of the smooth-walled passage, the cool air, the darkness that predates any memory, carry you down into the deep sleep that you came here for. The mystery is named. The question is alive. The continent is old and full of what it holds. And you are here, briefly and wonderfully, at this particular moment in the long story of life on the oldest inhabited land on Earth. The tunnels are waiting in the rock is waiting in the dark, and the dark is waiting for you, patient and cool and absolutely still. Sleep now, let the underground come, let the deep time hold you the way the rock holds everything, without effort, without urgency, with the absolute patience of the genuinely ancient. Sleep. The story is complete, the tunnels are there, and the night is very, very long and very, very good. Rest. There is a moment that happens sometimes when you're reading about a place you have never been, or listening to a story about a landscape you have only imagined, when the place stops being abstract and becomes somehow real in the body. Not the full reality of being there, with the specific weight of the air and the particular smell of the soil and the sounds that belong to that exact geography, but a kind of felt knowledge, a sense that the place exists in 3 dimensions and has a texture and a temperature and a quality of light or darkness that your imagination is rendering accurately enough to be genuinely informative. That moment, if you have had it while listening to this story, means that some part of you is now in the Australian underground, in the smooth-walled darkness of those ancient passages, feeling the cool air on your skin and the slight give of the compacted earth floor beneath your feet, and the closeness of the rock walls on either side. That is not nothing. That felt knowledge is a form of understanding that complements the intellectual knowledge of facts and hypotheses and geological processes. The emotional and sensory reality of a place is part of what the place actually is. And to know a place only through its geological description is to know it the way you might know a person through their medical records. Accurate in its way, but missing the dimension that makes the thing knowable as itself. The Australian underground is a place, it has a character, and even though you are not there in body, the story has given you something of that character, something of the quality of being inside ancient rock in a continent that is older than most of the landforms that make up the rest of the world. Carry that knowledge with you, not as something to act on immediately, but as part of the larger picture you carry of what the world is and how it has come to be what it is. The world is very old. The underground is older than the surface in the way that everything that does not change is older than everything that does. The surface of Australia is always being worked on, always being shaped and reshaped by wind and rain, and the expansion and contraction of rock in heat and cold. The underground changes more slowly. The deep underground barely changes at all on any timescale that matters to a human life. When you go underground in Australia, you go into something that has been more or less as it is for longer than the surface has had its current form. The underground is closer to the original Australia. The Australia that existed before the specific combination of weathering and erosion and tectonic activity produced the landscape we see today. And in that deep, stable, relatively unchanging underground, the traces left by the creatures that used it persist with a clarity that surface traces rarely achieve. A footprint on the surface is erased by the next rain. A burrow in soil is collapsed by the next flood. But a passage in rock, once made, endures. It endures through the changes of climate that came with the end of the last ice age. It endures through the decades of drought and the seasons of flood. It endures through the slow, imperceptible movements of the rock itself as it settles and shifts under the weight of the kilometers of material above it. The passage remains patient and exact, holding the dimensions and the surface characteristics that it had when it was first made, or very nearly so, long after the creature that made it is gone and long after the world it moved through on the surface has been transformed into something unrecognizable. That endurance is what makes the underground the great archive of biological history, not just in Australia but everywhere. The fossil record exists primarily in the underground, in the rock layers that preserve the remains of organisms as they are buried and mineralized over millions of years. The understanding of the history of life on Earth that paleontology has built over the past 2 centuries is an understanding drawn almost entirely from things found underground. The bones and the shells and the traces preserved in the rock are the testimony of the underground world about the living world that existed on the surface above it across hundreds of millions of years of biological history. The paleoburrows, if that is what the Australian tunnel formations are, add a dimension to this archive that has not previously been recognized. They are not fossils of organisms in the conventional sense. They are fossils of behavior, of the specific ways that organisms use the underground world, of the spatial relationships between the organism and the rock that surrounded it. They are, in a sense, more intimate than conventional fossils because they preserve not just the physical form of the organism, but the specific act of the organism moving through its world, pressing against the rock, leaving the marks of its body on the surfaces it touched. To read a paleoburrow is to read the behavior of an extinct animal in a way that no skeletal fossil can provide. The skeleton tells you what the animal was built like, what it ate, how big it was, how it moved in broad terms. The paleoburrow tells you what it did in a specific place, how it oriented itself in a confined space, how it used its claws and its body weight to move through rock, what dimensions of passage it preferred and why. It tells you something about the animal as a subject, not just as an object, about the animal as a creature with specific behaviors and specific choices made in specific environments. That kind of knowledge is rare. Most of what we know about extinct animals is structural, based on the forms of their preserved remains. Behavioral knowledge about extinct animals comes from a small number of sources, mostly trace fossils of various kinds, footprints and burrows and feeding traces, and from comparisons with the behavior of living relatives. The paleoburrows would be, for the large extinct marsupials of the Australian Pleistocene, one of the most direct behavioral records available, and they would complement, in a striking way, the other forms of knowledge we have about those animals. The skeletal record tells us about the diprotodon's body. The isotopic record of its bones and teeth tells us something about what it ate and where it lived. The distribution of its fossils tells us something about its geographic range. And the paleoburrows, if they are confirmed as its work, would tell us something about how it used the underground dimension of its environment, something that none of the other evidence sources can provide. This is why the investigation matters, not just as an interesting geological puzzle, but as a way of recovering knowledge about the specific living behavior of an animal that has been extinct for 45,000 years. Every new piece of knowledge about how the Australian megafauna actually lived in Australia is a piece of knowledge about the ecological past of the continent that we do not currently have, and that, once recovered, will change in some way our understanding of what Australia was and how it became what it is. The knowledge is there in the rock. The rock is patient. And the people with the questions and the tools to begin answering them are working slowly and carefully in the way that good science always works, toward an understanding that will be partial and provisional and genuinely illuminating. That is the nature of all honest inquiry into the deep past. It produces not certainty but better questions, not final answers but more accurate pictures of what the questions are and where the answers might be found. And in that process, the world becomes more interesting with each iteration, not less. Each new piece of knowledge reveals new dimensions of what is not yet known, new aspects of the mystery that were not visible before the question was asked. The Australian tunnels are part of that ongoing process of inquiry. They are a place where the mystery is real and the investigation is live, and the answers are still being sought. And they are, in the most physical and immediate sense, there, in the rock, in the dark, in the deep country of the ancient continent, waiting with all the patience of the geological world for whoever comes with the right question and the willingness to go underground and look. Tonight you have heard the question. Tonight the mystery has been named. And tonight, as the story comes to its natural resting place and the dark deepens around you, and the weight of sleep begins to press gently on the edges of your thinking, you can carry the question with you into the sleep that is coming. What is in the rock? What shaped those smooth walls? What moved through the ancient dark of the Australian underground and left the marks of its passage for us to find 45,000 years later? The rock knows, the rock has always known, And we are slowly, carefully, with the tools of modern science and the knowledge of the oldest living culture on Earth, learning to ask the rock the right questions in the right way to begin to hear its answer. That is enough for tonight. More than enough. The story has been told as far as it can be told with what is currently known. And what is not yet known has been named honestly, which is the best that any honest story about the genuine mysteries of the world can do. Let your breathing slow. Let your body settle into the surface that is supporting it. Let the day release its hold on your attention, and let the night have you fully, the way the deep underground has the creatures that live in it fully, completely, without reservation. The dark is receiving you. The quiet is receiving you. The long, slow patience of the sleeping world is receiving you. And somewhere far beneath the surface of the oldest continent, in the cool and the absolute dark of passages that have been unchanged for 45,000 years, the rock is doing what the rock always does, which is nothing and everything, which is holding, which is being the permanent record of what was once alive and moving and purposeful in the world above. Sleep now. Let the deep time hold you. Let the ancient underground of Australia be present at the edge of your dreaming as you go down into your own dark, your own cool, your own private underground of rest and repair and the slow renewal that sleep provides. The tunnels are there. The mystery is alive. The morning will bring its own questions and its own light. But tonight belongs to the dark and to the deep and to the patient rock and to the sleep that is finally fully here. Rest now. Sleep. The ancient continent holds you. Sleep. There is one more thing worth knowing before you let the story fully dissolve into the sleep that has been building through these long, slow passages of words and time. It is not a dramatic thing. It is not a new mystery or a new hypothesis or a new piece of evidence. It is simply a fact about the nature of old places and the people who live in them across very long spans of time. The Anangu people of the Western Desert, whose country includes the area around Uluru and Kata, have a concept called Chijukurpa that is often translated into English as the dream time, but the translation is inadequate and somewhat misleading because Chukurpa is not simply a past. It is not a creation story in the sense of something that happened once and is now over, leaving behind only the world as it currently exists. Chukurpa is an ongoing dimension of reality. It is the deep structure of the world, the layer beneath the visible surface where the creative forces that made the landscape are still active, still present, still accessible to those who know how to engage with them. The dreaming is not finished. The creation is not complete. The world is still being made continuously at the level of Chukurpa, and the visible world that we move through every day is the surface expression of that ongoing creative process. In this framework, the underground passages associated with dreaming beings are not simply historical features, places where something happened a long time ago. They are active places. They are locations where the creative force of Chukulpa is present and accessible. They are, in the most literal sense that the concept allows, alive. Not alive in the biological sense, but alive in the sense of being engaged in the ongoing process of creation that is the deep reality of the world. Whether or not that understanding is translatable into scientific terms, and whether or not it has implications for the physical investigation of the underground formations, is not something I can determine from the outside. What I can say is that it is a framework for understanding underground spaces that has been developed, refined, and tested across 65,000 years of engagement with the specific landscape of Australia, and that it has enabled people to live successfully in one of the most demanding environments on Earth for a span of time that exceeds any other continuous human cultural tradition by an enormous margin. That record of success is itself a form of evidence that the framework contains something accurate about the nature of the landscape it describes. The underground tunnels of Australia are, from the perspective of Jukurpa, not puzzles waiting to be solved by science. They are features of a landscape that has always been understood by the people who know it most deeply as having dimensions that are not immediately visible. The science is asking a question. The tradition has been answering a related question for a very long time. What the science and the tradition share is the recognition that the underground matters, that what is beneath the surface is as real and as significant as what is on it, that going below is going into something, not into nothing, and that what you find there, if you go carefully and respectfully and with the right kind of attention, is worth knowing. That is the invitation that the Australian Underground extends to anyone willing to accept it. Go below, ask the question, listen to what the rock has to say, and if you cannot go below in the literal sense, if you are here and the rock is there and the distance between you is too great for tonight, then go below in the other sense, the sense that sleep provides. Go below the surface of the day that has been. Go below the thoughts and the concerns and the running lists of things to be done. Go into the cool and the quiet and the dark that is your own private underground, the place where the body repairs itself and the mind lets go of what it has been holding, and the soul, if you believe in souls, does whatever souls do in the long darkness of sleep. The Australian continent is there, the tunnels are there, the mystery is there, and you are here at the edge of sleep, carrying with you the knowledge of an ancient underground world that most people have never heard of, and that the rock has been holding patiently for 45,000 years. It is a good thing to carry into sleep. It is a good thought to dissolve into. The world is old and it holds things we have not yet found, and the people who have been paying closest attention for the longest time know things we are only beginning to understand. And all of it is real, and all of it is there, and the morning will bring its own light to it. But for now, the dark is here, and the sleep is here, and the deep, patient underground of the ancient continent is here at the edge of your dreaming. Let it receive you. Sleep. Good night. The story does not end here. It never ends here. The questions that the Australian underground raises are the kind of questions that stay with a person, that surface at unexpected moments, that make you look at the ground beneath your feet with a different kind of attention. When you're in a garden or on a trail or standing on the hard floor of a city street, some small part of you now knows that beneath that surface there is another world, older and darker and quieter, and that in Australia that other world has been inhabited across timescales so vast they dissolve ordinary categories of thought. You know that the Diprotodon moved through the dark of the ancient Australian underground. You know that the Adnyamatanya people have traditions about the creative forces that move beneath the landscape of the Flinders Ranges. You know that the smooth walls of the Paleoburrow formations hold the marks of something that pressed against them in a world that existed before any living person was born. You know that the investigation is ongoing and the answers are partial, and the mystery is real, and the continent is patient with its secrets. That knowledge is yours now. It will not leave you, not entirely, and it will, in its small way, make the world more interesting. The world is always more interesting when you know what is underneath it. Rest now. Let the knowing settle. Let the weight of it become the weight of sleep pressing down, gentle and complete. The Australian underground is there. The tunnels are there. And you are here breathing slowly, drifting down into your own deep dark. Sleep well. The ancient continent keeps its watch. The Southern Cross is turning above the Australian continent right now, as it always does, as it has done every night for the 65,000 years that human eyes have been watching it from this land. The same stars, the same slow turning, the same dark country below, with its red soil and its white salt and its hidden passages in the ancient rock. Nothing about that has changed, and tonight, wherever you are connected to that unchanging darkness by the story you have just heard, by the knowledge of the underground world of the oldest inhabited continent on Earth, by the image of the smooth walls and the parallel scratch marks and the cool air, and the absolute silence of a place that was shaped by something enormous and warm-blooded and purposeful in an era before any memory reaches. Carry that image gently. Let it be the last thing your waking mind holds before it releases its grip on the day and lets the sleep take you fully into the dark that you came here for. The ancient continent is there. The tunnels are there. The mystery is alive and the investigation continues and the rock is patient. Sleep well.